My first doctor on my on my series of interviews, Dr. Ian Mortimer, not a medical doctor, but of course a doctorate. And you are more than just a doctor. I see that you're a fellow in the Royal Historical Society and a fellow in the Society of, please correct me if I'm mispronouncing this, Antiquaries of London?
Correctly pronounced, yes, and absolutely right. In fact, in Germany, I'm told I would be Doctor Doctor, so I've got two doctorates.
Really?
And in Germany, they specify both of them, but not here. So, yeah, my PhD is in medical history in the 17th century, but I don't specialize in a particular time. I specialize in perspective, our perspective on the past.
Right. Well,
and that distinguishes me really from pretty much all my contemporaries.
Really? Now, how would, because it was interesting this morning, my wife is Venezuelan. So she was born and raised in Venezuela, fled that country before things went utterly pear-shaped. They were only slightly pear-shaped. But I think she's always had a fair grasp of history, but she saw the future. She said, this is not going well. I got to get out of here. She brought her family with her over time. And I talked to her this morning and I said, you know what I think is most important about history and being a historian as your vocation is you give the world perspective on itself. Because if you cannot look back, just in microcosm, if a person cannot look back at their life and see what they've done and see how those actions have made them or unmade them, then they have no perspective. And how can they make wise choices going forward? And if we don't have not just a study of history, but an accurate one, how can we possibly know as a species how best to move forward?
Absolutely. And there's lots of different forms of perspective. There's the perspective on your own life, there's this perspective on society, but there's also the perspective on what we're really doing when we're looking at the past ourselves. I mean, I've already used with you the differentiation between what I think of the scholarship, which is good history and thorough history and accurate history and authentic history, and academia, which is the educational process, the discipline. Now, academia, something that's academic, is frequently inconsequential. And in my idea in thinking of history, if it's inconsequential, what's the point in doing it? The example I always use with people is, if you know the causes of the 100 Years' War or the American Civil War absolutely perfectly, in fullness, and then you say it alone in the garden when nobody's listening, you might as well be wrong, because no one's going to, it means nothing.
Right.
It means nothing.
Right.
And history only is a worthwhile discipline if it is meaningful. And that is why perspective is the most important thing, because everything else follows on from what you are trying to say, what meaning you are trying to grab from the past, from time, understanding ourselves at a time.
Right.
So perspective is the basic framework for meaning.
Is that how you feel? This kind of dovetails with the letter that you wrote to the Royal Historical Society, which is kind of how I found you. Because I was looking at historians, because I wrote, and I'm in the process of getting it hybrid published. I wrote a bit of historical science fiction. And I am fascinated with history in general. But I'm latching onto English history, particularly medieval history. This would be the Viking Age. But I started looking online at historians, and then I came upon you, and I came upon your letter to the Royal Historical Society, where, I mean, you advocated for several things, but one of which was, we as historians have got to find a better way to make a connection to the public so that the masses can understand what we do and how relevant it is. And I don't think we're having enough fun in doing that, for starters. It's too stodgy. It's too static.
Yes. And it comes from fear. I mean, the general perception, certainly in this country, the general perception about history is that it's all in the past, therefore it's not going to change the future, therefore it can be left the other day. A bit like our care of old buildings. And this is true right across Europe. They've lasted this long, we don't have to prioritize funding for them now, because if they've lasted this long, they'll be here next year. So there is this putting off and this deprecation of history, because it's not urgent, it's not pressing, it's not going to kill you.
Right.
Now, so therefore, there are worse things out there that may well kill you, or things that do need funding more urgently. So because of this, there is this uh, real battle amongst serious historians to get their voice heard. And at the moment, in our current climate, where we're looking at constantly diminishing reserves and funding for historical projects, people are just running scared of anything that lessens their value, which they interpret as being amongst their peer group, anything that lessens their respect. So they're becoming more accurate, more precise, more holier than thou, and further removed from their audiences. So they're actually shooting themselves in the foot.
Right. And I imagine this is a point of some contention because if this is the zeitgeist of the historical field, then do you feel as though you're swimming upstream, or are you perhaps making some inroads?
All the time, because I think they're actually missing out on both ends. They're not really. I mean, English academics, in my opinion, aren't trained enough in information and the sources of evidence. They're still relatively amateur in the way they choose evidence, select it, arrange it, make it say what they want to say, and then publish some article which they claim advances knowledge. And most of the time it does advance knowledge, don't get me wrong, and you do need an academic background to be able to do any of this stuff. But they don't go far enough, and we don't teach people the essence of information underpinning evidence. We don't really make use of the sharp end of history, which is to work out the truth in what's going on around us. We're missing a trick there. And at the same time, we're missing a trick on how we actually talk to the public. And it's because people are running scared. They feel that in order to be a serious historian, you've got to be a member of a university. And they just are held in check by the universities. I mean, I've written controversial things and been threatened by university presses that I will not be published by them again if I continue to do whatever. And they think that they can use the university system to hold people in control. And of course, with me, they can't, because my living comes from selling books to the public.
Right.
So I'm in that very rare position of having all the qualifications there are to get and having all the training there is, and yet not actually being dependent on the system. So I'm one of the very few people who can say these things without fear. And I'm also one of the few people who's actually qualified to criticize the academic establishment. So do I feel I'm swimming upstream every single moment, every single day? Yes.
Well, luckily for you, you're a runner, so you're very well conditioned for it. So, and we'll get into that. But I mean, there's so many points you make, and again, I've only had occasion to get about a chapter into your book because it arrived just as I was finishing a book on Mel Brooks. I
want to read that. Is that the Mel Brooks, the autobiography one?
That one is not his autobiography. That my wife will frequently get me books. I'm at a stage in my career and in my life, luckily, where I say, I have everything I need. Please don't get me anything. But people get me things anyway. For my birthday, for Christmas. So I just say, I want socks, all right? I could use socks. I'm old, all right? But I will never have enough books. But I will say, don't get me books for a while because I'm hopelessly backed up. At the same time, I've gotten a chapter into your book where you describe what it's like as you approach a medieval town or city or a parish.
The important thing about that book, which is called The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, is that it turns history on its head. It's, on the one hand, it's very accessible, it's easy to read, it allows me to use my sense of humour, which I do like doing in history. But the important thing about it is it turns history on its head. Most historians of any seriousness whatsoever start off by learning what everybody else knows, finding a body of research material that allows them to extend that, and then building that into their story, so they're retelling the story with this new information. Everything is evidence-led, which is fine, but it is very restrictive, and it doesn't actually prioritize what people want to know. And it doesn't highlight what we don't know, because you're only concentrating on what we do. So rather than concentrate on the evidence and spout out about what that tells us, my thinking in that book and the other three like it, so there's a medieval one, an Elizabethan one, a 17th century one, and a Regency one, late 18th, early 19th century. My idea in those books was to start off with what people really want to know. Mm-hmm. So if you could really go to the Middle Ages, what you're going to wear, etc., what's it going to be like, what dangers are there, what diseases might kill you and what doctors might kill you, and then prioritize that, take that information that people want to know and say, well, okay, that's what we want to know. Where do we find the answer? Mm-hmm. So they're really challenging books to write, really difficult. You have to know much more than you actually put in the book. But it's all geared around the reader. So hopefully, the trick is that people should find it effortless to read and completely satisfying because it is based around what I think they want to know.
Yes. Well, and I commend you on that because it is an easy book to read. It is because I suffered through a bachelor's degree and it wasn't in history, but I nearly minored in history because I was enjoying it so much. I kept taking history as my elective classes. And it was because I was fortunate enough to have history teachers that were good. And I'm sure you can identify with this. It isn't that a history teacher, in order to be good, has to know their history. How good are they are imparting it to their students so they don't just drone on soporifically. And I had a couple of history teachers that, as you do in your book, The Time Traveler's Guide to History, you put them there in the moment. You are in your present mind in 14th century England, in a town. You've summoned the smells, the sights, the tastes, all of it. The 21st century traveler will look at a 14th century house and wonder, where's the beauty? Where's the decoration? And you point out that functionality was beauty back then because things were so necessary that they literally kept you alive. And that became its own form of harmony and beauty. And that's how you had to see things.
Yeah, that is it. I mean, you need to learn to see with different eyes. When I was writing the second Time Traveler's Guide, which was Elizabethan England, I was walking along through a field a few miles away from here. And I was trying to force myself to think through how somebody in the 16th century would have seen that field. And it was very much along those similar lines. And in the course of that exercise of, hold on, this field is full of grain, therefore it's beautiful, as opposed to one that's been damaged through storms, therefore it's ugly. In the course of that, I was walking along and I suddenly had this realization, which is blindingly obvious when you think about it, but every act of seeing is unique because no one's ever going to have exactly the same view as you on that ground, at that spot, in the same direction, ever again. If they stood on the same spot, it'd be a different time. If they're there at the same time, they're actually on a different spot. It might be more or less the same, but actually every act of seeing is unique. And then it follows on that every act of hearing is pretty much unique. And when you realize this unique position you have in the world, you realize that every time you're talking about your sensory, what you share with people, you're actually going through this whole process of thinking through what it's like for other people. It's something we do with our contemporaries. We do it all the time. I know what it must have been like for you over there, or you seeing this just after I saw it. We do it at our own time, but we never do it with the past. And we just assume, unless you know otherwise, that people saw and felt and thought in the past just like us.
Right.
I mean, the next book I have coming out, which is about the perceptions of the Middle Ages, it's called Medieval Horizons. It's very much along these lines because people think technology is change. And I have to say this is truer for Americans I've spoken to than even for Europeans. And most Europeans are pretty bad on this subject. But you think technology has changed. Well, technology is not change. And the easiest way I can get this across is we often say that Shakespeare speaks for us. He speaks of the emotions, what it's like to be human. And then he knew nothing about technology. He knew nothing about steam trains or cars or nuclear bombs or flight, etc. Yet he speaks to us. Technology has changed nothing for what we are, but there's no way that Shakespeare speaks for people 400 years before his time. In 400 years before his time, there's a great quote I love, which is from a late 12th century chronicler who describes a man is not a man until he has felt the blow of an opponent's mace upon his helmet and felt the full weight of his body crush him. For God's sake. Oh, yes. And felt his teeth grinding underneath the blow of that helmet. Shakespeare doesn't speak to people like that. He does not speak to people who go on crusade. He's a different world. We've changed. And all that change is not the result of technology over the Middle Ages.
Right.
It's the result of many other social changes, all different perspectives. And once you realize that, you realize that the whole of time is really open for you to rethink and look at what people thought and heard. And it's actually very exciting. Time is really exciting.
It's funny when you're talking about the uniqueness of perspective, and as it changes every single second and as you take every step. In my book, I call it Soldier of Ages. It's about a soldier who is basically inserted into different historical times to fight in battles to ensure their outcome. And I realize I have to impart to the reader the basic idea of what it is like to exist in time so this alien technology can plant you in different places. So you have your X, Y, and Z axis of moving through dimensions, but time is the fourth dimension. So, and what you were talking about is basically that concept. You're moving through space, through physical space, but you're also moving through time. And every second that passes, even if you're standing in the same spot, your your T axis of time changes. And just by simply existing, we are still moving through the dimension of time, and it changes constantly. And when you talk about technology, people think of it as change. Ever since we were apes that picked up sticks, we've had technology. So it is the one constant we can never get rid of. I know that there are Luddites among us who wish to push back against technology all the time, maybe because they fear that change tends to accompany it. But as you say,
I think change is more profound if you don't have technological change.
Exactly.
I mean, if you think in terms of the book, we understand Shakespeare, going back to Shakespeare, because he speaks the same language as us. Technology has stabilized the language. It's stopped there being any change. You look at 400 years before Shakespeare, you will not be able to read English.
Right.
You'll probably get about 3 words in every 20.
Yeah.
You really won't be able to read it fluently. You will not feel confident for meanings. And you will also be looking for meanings that simply aren't there. You'll be looking for insights and a sensitivity to the personality and the human character, which simply isn't there in the earlier writing. So it's a very different language. Technology has stabilized things.
I think it's interesting that in economics, you can have 2 Nobel Prize winners who are polar opposites of each other philosophically. You have Paul Krugman and you have Milton Friedman. And I think economics is almost more the study of human behavior. And I think when I look at history, you not only have to understand actual historical accounts of things, you have to understand human psychology a bit. You have to understand philosophy to a degree. You probably have to understand. Yes.
The philosophy. Without the philosophy, you can't do history.
Right. And
it really is. This is one of the things when I talk about perspective, I just simply say we don't teach people about the philosophy of history. I mean, how can you actually conceive of a different time? How can you think you know something about the past? And that actually is a philosophical question. The historian would say, oh, well, we have evidence. But why do you trust some evidence and not other evidence? How do you actually go beyond evidence to work out what really happened? Otherwise, you're just studying pieces of paper, not the past. So the philosophy, absolutely. I mean, I use philosophy every day. I use economics every day. I mean, I'm absolutely with you on the economic front. Unless you understand the economics of society, you will not understand society. You need the principles. You need to know about supply and demand. You need to know about where pressures are caused. You need to know about flow of money, money supply, velocity of money, rather, I'm thinking, because you need to know how people faced economic pressures in the past. So, philosophy, economics, I mean, these things are essential. My A-levels, which is the exams you do here about the age of 18, I did maths, history, economics. Mm-hmm. I use all 3 of them every day, pretty much all the time I'm working or conscious. So, and the one I should have done as well was philosophy.
Right.
Sorry.
No, it just seems that from a forensic perspective, as you're disassembling the information you have, the scene you come upon, metaphorically, as you're researching, you're looking at human behavior. And you're also looking at environmental behavior. You're piecing together so much of what has happened before. And if an historian is trying to divine what has happened and to have a real understanding of it, you have to understand the factors at work. And it isn't just, all right, we have this evidence. Well, why did the people do what they did? Why did this weather happen? And was, in fact, when you talk about how drainage of a swamp over time allows a port to exist, or if there's a storm that comes and wrecks a town, it might actually, you talk about one, I can't remember the name of the town, but it so moved mountains of gravel and sand that it clogged up the port, and within a couple of decades, the town that accompanied it was dead. Yeah. And so here you have human behavior that is reacting to an environmental catastrophe. And if you don't understand human behavior and economics and philosophy, how can you actually portray an accurate picture of history?
Yeah. And where I live in southwest England, it's about 190 miles from London, is the edge of the moorland. So most people will just think of that pretty area of the country. There's a very specific reason I'm living here. And it's not just because my ancestors come from here. It is because this community has only gradually changed over the last 1,000 years. That direction, so looking westwards from here, there's very little between here and the High Moor. But what land there is, you can map in the Middle Ages as population expanded, as they moved up the side of the hills and started farming higher and higher land. Now, as you go up, it gets much more dangerous to farm land because the risks of harvest failure are that much greater. So if you get up to 1,000 feet, your risks of harvest failure, I can't remember what the exact statistic is, but it's something like 100 times as great a risk of 2 consecutive years harvest failure as there are at sea level. Now, with 100 times greater risk, that second year harvest failure is what's going to kill you. It's not the first year, it's the second year after you've got to use all your grain because you've got nothing else to live on.
Right.
So as people are starting to move higher and higher up, you know that the pressures of society are forcing them up that high. You know, they can have apples up there, but the grain is not going to survive. They can't bank on it. So therefore, they're risking famine. You know that the pressures are pushing them up there. Therefore, you understand the community that's pushing them up there. It respects the land ownership of the people who are down on the better land. You know that the people being pushed up to the higher are going to be younger sons, people who've moved into the area, people with who are more marginal in every way. And because I've sort of spent so much time here and read so much about the medieval landscape around here, I can work out when some farms were settled in the 12th century and at 1,000 feet, and thinking, well, the whole area, this whole parish must have been pretty much full by then. So what does that say? Well, Lord of the Manor either then had to let people go and lose control of them, or he had to establish a market. So he had something else to do where they weren't dependent on farming and their own land. And that's what happened here in 1207. There was a market set up. It wasn't set up by the people who wanted to trade themselves. It was set up by the Lord of the Manor so he could keep people on the land. And I didn't realize that the Lord of the Manor had to set that market up until I realized from the pressure of people moving up to marginal land that he either had to let them starve or risk starvation, had to let them go to town, or give them something else to do.
Right.
And so it's just seeing how the whole thing works at this level. You couldn't really do this in somewhere that's developed an awful lot. But the town I'm in, Morton Hampstead, is still about 1,600 people, which it's been for the last 400 years. So I've got a model here of the whole of society, which I can use as don't tell everybody out there this, but they're my biological experiment over the last 900 years. Gotcha.
Well, I remember you talking in the book about how yes, there is a system in place. You have a Lord of the Manor, and the resources that they control sort of flow throughout the community, so everyone is at least able to subsist. But if things get bad enough, even though it is against the law, the people who work the land and are able to live off of it will just simply leave under threat of what must have been perhaps a mortal punishment, a capital punishment, but they left because they knew if they stayed, they were going to die. The resources just weren't there. So even though the system prohibited it, human behavior will trump that because it's just about survival at that point.
Yeah, there's a great line from, I've forgotten, one of the 19th century writers who says, I defy you to agitate a man with a full stomach.
Yeah.
And that one line really is brilliant because it sums up why things could be outrageously terrible and no one does anything to change it. And yet food gets hard to find and then there's revolution.
Exactly.
I mean, that essential element of sustenance. You can't think about anything else if you're hungry.
What I have been bemoaning is in the last several years, there's been quite a bit of a misunderstanding of history and how it applies to our lives today. And because of the internet, quite a bit of willful misinterpreting of it or disinformation. The writer Clint Watts, who has quite a bit of counterterrorism and cyber terrorism experience, talks about disinformation and how it's used, propaganda, how it's used. And I can't think of a more nefarious way to undermine progress than to misrepresent what is true and what has happened. And that, to me, is one of the largest threats we're facing right now.
There has always been misinformation and disinformation. I mean, by and large, I agree with you, don't get me wrong. But this is not a new thing.
No, it is not.
One of my special subjects is the death of Edward II and how we can be sure it did not take place in Berkeley Castle in 1327, as their entire establishment would have you believe. Mm-hmm. And how do I do that? I pull apart the evidence to work out, in the famous terms, who knew what and when they knew it. Uh-huh. And you could establish that the announcement was made and could not possibly have been checked. The announcement was made by somebody who did not let anybody else see a dead body and show it as that of the king. This announcement was made. It was made by the court in good faith after they received the information. All this information was circulated. There was a funeral. It was all to stop people trying to rescue the king from prison. Mm-hmm. The king himself was actually moved to prison. And after an event in 1330, his jailer let him go. And he went to Italy and lived out the rest of his life in Italy. It's the most extraordinary story. I mean, it's the sort of thing that you would think would make Italian opera look tame in its imaginativeness. But it happened. Now, it's a result of disinformation. It's a result of cover-ups. It's got a lot in common with the way people manage power today through information and covering up. Mm-hmm. And the whole barefaced lie in the first place, the king is dead, it's on a international scale. I mean, this is something we see now all the time, and we just think of it as being so modern because the past, we don't tend to think in terms of information and reality differing, but it always has done. But of course, there are reasons for people to move strategies of disinformation. We see one, for example, in Russia now, and various other examples of this around the world. So I think it is. There are almost like waves of it. It's a bit like famine or plague. That these things do grow. There's always hunger, but sometimes there's famine, and there's always disinformation. But now we are running scared because there's so much of it, and people are using it deliberately as well. I mean, like people use famine in warfare deliberately. It's we are facing a very perilous time on information front, which is another reason why for my battle with the Royal Historical Society that they should be teaching people how to determine whether stories and evidence actually has a basis in truth. Right. And it's something we really, we were challenged by. I agree.
I would think that historians, like one of the historians that probably found his dance card rather full once the past few years happened, I'll just put more of a fine point on it, is once Trump became president in our country, is I think it's Robert Meacham. It might be John Meacham. I don't want to talk out of school. An American historian. And he talks about how he was surprised that it took us this long to get an autocrat in the White House. I have a fair understanding of rudimentary psychology. My uncle was a psychologist, and I myself have done cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's been a life changer for me, but understanding the workings of the mind. Well, we've always had misinformation and disinformation, as you know. 50 years ago, the guy with the conspiracy theory was at the bus station handing out pamphlets, and he was largely ignored because there was no truth to it. It was pablum. It was tripe. But now the guy with the conspiracy theory has a podcast or a website that has millions of followers because he or she are able to reach anyone that they want to with the click of a button worldwide. That's never existed, and we have never had to reckon with that as a global society. And I think we're still feeling the repercussions of it because there are people on social media that you simply cannot move off of a point that is demonstrably untrue.
Yeah.
Because
I don't want to disagree with any of that, but there is another way of looking at it and seeing that we have always had these things.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to put anybody's noses out of joint, but look at the Catholic Church in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. You had then what is basically an untruth. People knew was an untruth.
Right.
The Earth is not the center of the universe. Galileo was locked up for life for saying the Earth goes around the sun.
Right.
The disinformation. I mean, you say that the purveyor of disinformation has never had the mouthpiece that a modern conspiracy theorist has. Well, I'm not sure that's true because the church had enormous reach in the 16th century. Mm-hmm. And I get your point that people now can start rumors and they can spread very rapidly and out of control. And it's the reach, I think, that's the rapid reach that is significantly different. You can have disinformation in the past, and it just like Trump might say something that's not true about sticking bleach in your veins or something like that, and it's dangerous.
Yes.
But then the Catholic Church can get things wrong as well as it did over the years, and politicians lied, etc., over the years.
Right.
But what we don't have in the past, when you had disinformation being spread, such as when the Great Plague came back in 1665, there was a terrible outbreak in London, and we had the system to control it. Mm-hmm. We had the system whereby when plague was found in a house, watchers were put on the house, no one could go in or leave, the windows were boarded up, and food was handed to the people left on the inside. Now, in the parish of St Giles in London, they decided that this wasn't really plague. Mm-hmm. They were going to free the boarded up people inside that house. They released them, they carried them around the town, and 86,000 people died as a result. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily directly as a result of that one act, but a lot of them, 12,000 people in that one parish. Mm-hmm. The disinformation, though, although it was hugely destructive, was still very much on a local level. Mm-hmm. So I think what we have now is things having worldwide reach almost instantaneously, mm-hmm. so no one can control it. There is no breaking zone. There's no time to actually pull these things in. So hysteria can take over the whole world in a matter of hours.
Yes. Well,
and I think that is a real difference from the past.
Yes. Well, then I do take your point. Yes. And this is why it's always good to talk to people who have information that you don't, or a perspective that you don't. As the neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris likes to say, I don't want to be wrong any longer than I have to be. And so, yeah, I can add your learned perspective to the thrust of my point. And yes, where I still see we're in accord is that now we have a way of driving it that is instantaneous, and that is something that is I don't know how we get around it, because if you also have an understanding of psychology, I remember the psychologist I worked with, the therapist I had, may he rest in peace. He told me memory is very selective. We color our pasts personally. We do it partially because the human memory is flawed and biased, and also partially because so it can be emotionally and intellectually palatable. And that's why you need a rigorous fact-checking procedure to go along with your recollection of things. And if you're not able to do that, and as a society, we tend to do that as well. We like to talk about the good old days. Well, as an historian, you can tell us, in the words of Billy Joel, the good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems.
Well, the latter might be otherwise. I was actually really spooked yesterday. I walked through the kitchen and my wife had the news on, and it was talking about Bolsonaro's supporters refusing to accept the verdict. And the line I remember was a bloke being interviewed, and he was saying, I don't know what the question was, but he was saying what he wanted was a military dictatorship because anything would be better than a communist government or something like that. Lula's communist government. And I suddenly realized in that moment he was quite animated about this. Mm-hmm. That is the way the democracy breaks down. And if you think in terms of the last 1,000 years in the Western world, and by the Western world I mean the generic Western world, so America, Australia, etc., we are really, the big conversation we've had is how do we get those in power to listen to ordinary people? Mm-hmm. You think 1,000 years ago, something you'll know from your own research, 1,000 years ago, the king's rule is law. I mean, when Canute decided to get rid of the most important men in the country who could threaten him, he just summoned them all to London and killed them all. Yeah. Likewise, St. Bryce's Day, 1002, wasn't it? That Ethelred had all the Danes in England that he could possibly killed. Mm-hmm. The king's rule there was adamant. And you can see how that starts to be controlled with the rise of the English common law in the 12th century. And you can see how it further became controlled because of Magna Carta and then the advent of Parliament in the 1260s. And increasingly, but by 1399, a king could be deposed. Mm-hmm. And you can see how there is this not necessarily one-way street in terms of power, but there's a one-way street in terms of making those in power listen to the ordinary person. Mm-hmm. And that always comes all the way down to one man, one woman, one vote, which is the case here in the UK from 1928 onwards. Mm-hmm. Now, if we then start going against that and saying, you might have the vote, but we're going to put people back into power who don't have to listen to you. Right. We have reversed things right the way back to how they were when there was no law. Right. We are actually threatening the basis of our law, and we're threatening the basis on which we hold those in power to account. We are empowering the mechanisms of dictatorship here. Right. Now, I know that Brazil is far from being a lovely, cuddly democracy. Right. And quite a lot of countries that do notionally embrace the electoral system, the democratic system, are similar. But in that moment, I suddenly realized how you do revert, how you do go from a country which is a liberal democracy to the opposite. And it comes when those who are voted out of power will not accept a government because there's nothing in it for them. It would be better to rebel and put into place a dictator than to accept. They no longer want, they want the bigger bully, basically. Right. Yeah. They want their dictator. And that was quite a horrifying moment because as we have greater pressure on the world's resources, I think that's going to be more and more the case.
When you're talking about a democracy, you're talking about something that is actually rather fragile because it isn't simply taken by a show of force and held onto for as long as it will be held onto. You need two basic things, and this is just the basics. You have to have candidates that run for office that say that they will respect the results of an election, a free and fair election, and candidates that will participate in the peaceful transfer of power. And when we had our previous president basically refuse to engage in either of those two concepts, I would shout from the hilltops, people, can't you see that this is awful? And an astonishingly high number of them did not think so. And as you said, I think they want the bigger bully.
They can't see what a country without a law is like. Right. Therefore, they just take it for granted that still people will obey the law when it comes to them and their issues and their property. Well, if you've got the basic founder of all power, the government, which is breaking the law, they're going to endorse other people breaking the law. Right. And their henchmen breaking the law. And so the whole law breaks down. And we end up back where we were before the 1160s, when basically law is a matter of local force.
I don't want people to make perfect the enemy of the good because, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican in my country. Those are our primary parties. I'm me. But I have tilted more towards one over the other because one, frankly, just says we'll accept the tenets of democracy. Well, they don't give me much choice in that occasion because the other party is endorsing far too many candidates that want nothing to do with those tenets. And my wife, to your point about Brazil being Venezuelan, she knows a lot more about Brazil than I do. And she said, Lula's going to win. Lula's terrible, by the way, but better than Bolsonaro because Lula,
Wow.
Lula, who went to jail for corruption, she said, still better than Bolsonaro because Lula will accept the results of an election that he might lose. And that's where we reverted to. We've reverted to this absolute minimal standard. But I'm afraid if we don't embrace it as a nation, we might be looking at the circling of the drain of the democracy that we know, which is where I think history comes in. You have a very qualified grasp on what happens when you don't have a democracy. You've seen the detritus of it.
One of the things, most of the history I write about is late Middle Ages through to 17th century.
Right.
But the bits I find at the moment and have for some little while found the most powerful to talk about are the earlier Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. So really 11th and 12th centuries. And when people think nothing much happened in the 11th century, I start off with, okay, well, where I'm living in Devon, 1 in 5 people was a slave. And 1 in 5 is pretty much the height as it was in the States at any given time. So when we think about slavery in the States and how pernicious that was, that's what it was like here.
Right.
You don't own your own children.
Right.
Your owner can abuse them, kill them, do what he wants to them.
Right.
I mean, this is not just slave working conditions. This is not some joke. This is the right of somebody else having right to the power of life and death over your own children.
Right.
Now, can you imagine that? No, you can't. Can you imagine there being no law? It's just being a matter of the lord of the manor exacting what he wants from his people and not being able to do anything about it.
Right.
Having no right to stand up and say he's wrong, that he shouldn't rape your wife or something like that. You cannot imagine this society. And it was bloody miserable, I imagine, for all the people who lived through it.
Right.
And yet they found solutions to all these problems. They worked out how to establish codes of behavior that held people to account and did a little bit to bring in some order. Now, we're engaged, it seems, worldwide in the process of smashing up the order that we've created. The thing is, once you start smashing up the law, and this fundamentally, the absolute basis of it is the legal changes in the 12th century. Start of the 12th century, there's next to no law in terms of its application. By the end of it, there is law. Now, if you're going to travel elsewhere in the world and choose where you're going to go, are you going to be worried by no mobile phone signal? Maybe, but probably not. Are you going to be worried by complete breakdown of law and order? Absolutely. How many people are going to get to Sudan at the moment or somewhere like that?
Right.
So what I see us endangering right now, and it's coming from the really polarized debates around Trump, around Bolsonaro, is our danger of throwing away the legal systems which we take for granted, which we have great difficulty rebuilding if we ever do lose them.
Yeah, and there's actually, to your point, and you'll find I'll be referencing movies as much as you'll be referencing books. There's our cultural divide right there. But
not a bad thing.
Yeah, the 1966 movie A Man for All Seasons, based on a play, Sir Thomas More, and I don't want to misquote him. I'll be paraphrasing more than anything, but he's speaking to his future son-in-law who wants to be a barrister and wants to do good in the world. He wants to fight evil. And he's willing to, he already tells Sir Thomas More, who's a famous barrister, he says, I'll be willing to go outside the law to get the bad guys. And he said, would you do this to the devil himself? Yeah, he says, in order to get the devil himself, I would cut down every law in Britain. And he said, and having cut down every law in Britain, what would save you from the ill winds that would blow? And to me, I wish everyone could just watch that movie.
Yeah.
And just for that one moment, and I've referenced it on Twitter, which of course is a sneeze in a whirlwind, but we've all too often abandoned critical debate in order to simply prove a point, and people abandon critical thinking too often because something feels right, but you have to remain tethered to that.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, movies have encouraged that, because there is this sense in many movies whereby, despite the law saying this, I'm on the side of right, and therefore you've got to do the morally right thing, not the legally right thing.
The vigilante.
And exactly, yeah. Frequently we see that motif in movies coming across to the younger generation. Let's face it, it's. I do still watch films, but not very often.
Right.
It's the younger generation that really picks up on the popular culture and is inspired by it to apply it to their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have thought that sort of you do what's morally right. You know, the Wild West, I suppose. Yeah, Kurosawa films and your Wild West responses to those. Your Ennio Morricone, not also Sergio Leone characters.
Right. John Ford.
Exactly. They're acting outside the law, but they're morally right. We want them on our side. That's inspiring people to go beyond that. They feel as a result they are empowered to make their own decision as to what is right and wrong. There's something I'm writing about at the moment with my pubs study, where people are lying all the time about the past. And the other day, as I was walking along the street between one supposedly medieval pub and another, I was thinking about how we think about the past. And I was thinking about the idea came from my own family history. And I remembered speaking to my grandmother about her great aunt, who she'd met as a young girl. And she just remembered one thing about her, size of her hands. And that one thing becomes a peg on which you remember somebody through life.
Right.
It's a bit like the ancient Egyptian idea that a man dies twice. First, when he physically dies, and secondly, when people forget his name. Mm-hmm. And so I had this one memory of this woman and her small hands, that one thing. And I thought, well, this is what pubs are doing, really. They're pinning their heritage, their marketing history on the fact they've got this one fact that they were, Charles II drank here, or they're built in 1423 or whatever. And I was thinking, that's fine. Nothing wrong with having that one detail on which you pin your identity, your historic identity, your heritage. But what if it's a lie? You've pinned everything on something that's worthless.
Right.
I mean, that really struck me as empowering for carrying on this crusade. But then you also think about, most people would say there's a whole spectrum of lies, aren't there? At one end, there's totally inconsequential ones, like a pub claiming to date from the 15th century and it was built in the 1700s. Inconsequential lie. At the other end, massive, world-changing lies, like Ukraine's full of Nazis.
Right.
From the Russian perspective. Now, one is obviously of huge world consequence, the other one is not. But where do you decide on this spectrum of lies where the meaningful ones are? Where you can let some go and where you have to stop? Who is to be the arbiter? Who is to make that decision? The liar themselves? That wouldn't be a safe thing to do.
Right.
It's surely got to be the person who's adversely affected.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole question of who stands in and invents a new rule if the old one isn't good enough?
Right.
Who is the position of the John Ford character who can go beyond, the John Ford film, who can go beyond the legal rule and actually do the morally correct thing, even though the law is against it? We've got real problems if we throw away the systems we've grown up with and have grown up with for the last 900 years.
Right.
I'm really quite worried about the future. So coming back to something you said about 10 years ago, the past was never that great and the future's not as bad as you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
But I think the past certainly wasn't that great. I'm not so sure the future's that much better either.
That's the thing. I was planning on asking you how you think we're trending, and I think I have my answer. But I think we're facing it, obviously. As an historian, I would think you might back me up on this. We face existential questions in every era of our history. There is just the question of survival. And sometimes you get some of the basics down where your immediate physical survival is guaranteed. but still there is a question of your spirit, your soul, not to put too fine a new age point on it. But there's been talk about how postmodernism has negatively impacted our present, because postmodernism as a philosophical movement was, truth is much more relative than we see, and your truth is not necessarily their truth, and it begins to muddy the waters a bit. You can go too far with postmodernism, and you can begin to think that, yes, while there are different experiences, and we should allow that one person's reality is not necessarily the same as another's, there is a hard and fast actual morality and truth that should be universally seen. It is simply not a good thing to simply murder another person to take what they have. It is not a good thing to bear false witness. And I'm not a religious person. I'm simply using a turn of phrase. Yeah. It is simply not morally right to be a liar, even if in the short term you might achieve something from it. After a while, you're going to have to repair that existential damage.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, but what I know, my take on postmodernism is all geared around what it says about the knowledge we have of the past. And from my point of view, while I certainly agree you can take postmodernism's principles too far, to an absurd degree, it's been very helpful for me in questioning the basis on which people think they know about the past. What they're really studying so often is simply a piece of evidence that may or may not tell them the truth. So therefore, postmodernism has been a very powerful tool for me in teaching me how I can heighten my own source criticism to get closer to what we can work out did or did not happen in the past. And sometimes it's as valid to work out what didn't happen as what did. So on that front, from a professional level, it's been a wholly good exercise. It's shown what we don't know, shown where evidence is lacking. And further to that, it's also useful in showing people relative morality. You talk about there being a morality which is true, that it's wrong to murder people and take their possessions, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, I'm not rushing out to take anybody's possessions, but morality changes hugely down the centuries. In fact, when I look back over the last 200 years, I think anything has changed as much as human morality. When, it's last men hanged for sodomy in this country was in 1835. And it was an unpopular act. People wanted to carry on hanging people for sodomy. When the Clapham sect, which is a group of evangelical Christians in London, were agitating to get rid of slavery throughout the whole British Empire, at the same time they were agitating to hang more homosexuals. So you have a morality which, on one hand, we can think, well, of course they were right to be getting rid of slavery, but then we're appalled by the other things they thought were right. The morality about the way that we look at women in society. I mean, that is such a sensitive and rapidly changing thing. I'm thinking of an example here in the 17th century from my Restoration Time Traveller's Guidebook, so late 17th century. Men obviously within an English common law system were the spokesman for the marriage partner, so they had complete control over their wives. And what really struck me then was the morality that women saw in men beating their wives. So much so that they would actually ask men to beat their wives and want them to do it in order to teach that woman a lesson when she was behaving badly. Right. Now, we cannot possibly imagine that in society today. No. And I can't imagine my wife going down the road to our friends and saying to the husband, you ought to beat that wife of yours because she's behaving this way or that way. Right. No, so our morality isn't true through time. And one of the problems I do have as a historian is working against this assumption that what we think of as right is always right all the way through time. And when I'm going back to the early part of the Middle Ages, so 11th, 12th century, obviously slavery then is an appalling thing. But what about the morality of somebody who sells their child into slavery? They may well do so because they've got other children. They can't afford to feed that child. And the money that comes in will allow their other children to survive. And the sale of the other child to the younger child to a slaver might guarantee that child's life when otherwise they can't afford to feed them. we've got to suspend our own moral judgments when we look at the morality of a time which is so desperate, and which is so desperate endorses slavery on a daily basis. So the whole idea of an everlasting moral code, which is always right in all times, such as slavery is an evil, it's, although I believe it, I have to allow that there are other times that don't believe it. So although I think it's perpetually true, with my background and where I come from, I have to acknowledge there are times when people who existed who do not think like that, who've had to do something else, sometimes for moral reasons. So it's a very interesting question, but I have real difficulty with the audiences I speak to, where I have, normally in a very short period of time, have to convince them that their moral code for the world isn't necessarily always true.
Yes. Yeah, and I think what we're talking about is the Overton window, what is morally acceptable in a society at any given time, which is always shifting. And yes, I take your point. I think I probably could have been more clear. There are certain moral absolutes that we can see are always going to be true. But yes, every society has been grappling with them. And as a society evolves, certain things finally move out of the Overton window and they're abandoned because it's just seen as, okay, this is no longer appropriate. But yeah, to your point, the tendency now, and you see this on social media a lot because it's very comfortable to judge from your chair, or from your seat as you're looking at your phone, to judge a person's actions in the past and immediately apply today's Overton window to them. And it's not always being understanding of the circumstances that individual is living in. Yeah. And I usually like to remind myself, if I'm ever guilty of it, and anyone else, that how does it feel to know that in about 10 or 20 years, you're going to be seen as awful by somebody who is applying the same judgment to you? But again, that returns us to the point of, are we trending upwards? I mean, if you look at it in a long enough timeline, I would say that we are. You talked about the life expectancy of your average 14th century commoner. And I think the average age of anyone at any given moment in the 14th century was maybe 21.
That would be the median, yeah.
Yeah, the median age. And so nutrition, things like that. Obviously, you're a medical historian as well. We don't do leeches anymore, things like that. We don't let out the bad blood. So we've trended upwards in many ways, but we are still in a moment where I agree with you. I don't know what the immediate future is bringing, but it's going to be tumultuous. I know that.
Yeah. No, I see my major concerns are pressure on resources. Pressure on resources means those who've already got them and come in the world with great assets are proportionally even richer because they've got something that no one else can get hold of.
Right.
Think of land. And my book, Centuries of Change, really focused on land. Yes, we should be worried about energy, obviously. Yes, we should be worried about distribution of food around the world. But the most important thing to worry about, as a European here especially, is land. I mean, the density of the population, the density of settlement in England is comparable with that of India at the moment.
Really?
And it's reached that level. People per head, heads per square mile, it's comparable. England is now comparable with India. There is not enough land, yet ownership patterns go back hundreds of years, so that vast amounts of England are owned by agricultural landowners, landed gentry, noblemen, noblewomen, who basically inherit vast amounts of land, which if anybody wants to get a house, they've got to earn enough and get a mortgage and they get their little plot. And increasingly people can't afford to do that. And proportionately, those who inherit 25,000 acres have never got to worry, and they're that much richer than somebody who's got to work even harder for their eighth of an acre or their 12th of an acre. So because we need land to live, to produce food for our infrastructure, and quite a lot of land can't be developed because for whatever reason, it's a lake, it's a cliff face or whatever, there's less and less land to exploit. So therefore, there's more and more competition for that land, prices for that land go up and up and up, meaning that somebody comes into this world with no land, with no assets, has to work all a bit harder just to get that little bit. Meanwhile, the value of the total, the landowner's portion, is going up more and more. Society is being wrenched apart by the pressure for resources. And land, to my mind, is the top one. Energy may well rival it before long. Recent experience being sanitary here. But these pressures mean that you've got to have somewhere to live. So these pressures mean that the people who come in the bottom aren't going to have the same values. They're not going to care whether they have the vote if they can't eat. Mm-hmm. They are going to be like that chap in Brazil saying it's better that we have a military dictatorship than accept an alternative to the politics that can deliver us for us. And I am worried for the future because I think it's going to be just as bloody as the past. I think it's going to be just as divided as the past. I don't see any sign of the legendary The Last Man, where everybody, the end of history happens and nothing significant happens in the future because we've all worked out how to live in a peaceful liberal democracy respecting of law and order. I just don't see it happening. If it did happen, it would be like the hour hand of a clock that gets to the point of perfection and then moves on and we all fall apart again. And I do worry for the future that we are going to reenact all the mistakes of the past, except, of course, coming back to where we were talking about earlier, with the means to make disinformation worldwide instantaneous, with the means to destroy tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, if somebody wants to, with nuclear warheads or biological warfare.
Right.
I mean, so we're looking at a breakdown of law and order, which this time around will make the 11th century look like a teddy bear's picnic. Yes,
because of, what you just mentioned, we have nuclear devices. And so far, there's been a truce. It's just been mutually assured destruction. But you only need one bad actor to throw that to the wind. And when you get enough people who are desperate, who are angry, and you have someone come along, and this is the story of the autocrat. I have the answer, and only I have it, by the way. But just give your rights to me. I'll put that food in your belly. I will do whatever I need to do. I'll take care of that. I mean, Mussolini famously got elected because he said, I'll make the trains run on time. And he did do that. He just ruined everything else. But that's what people were concerned about. And the malignant grifter will see that and seize upon it. So what is the remedy then? I mean, having studied how we overcome these things throughout history, my talk with my wife this morning was, what I see the problem is that people are too willingly selecting with algorithms that are designed to encourage them to do so. They're selecting biases and they're remaining in echo chambers and they're not allowing themselves to think critically. And if they can't see that there's a problem because their bubble won't let them out of it, then we won't even do the things we need to do to solve it. And so my answer is people have to learn to think more critically. I don't know how we get that to happen.
Well, education is going to be a big part of it.
Yes.
And education is, if we don't invest in education, I think any government, and this is true for, I think, all governments throughout the world,
right.
The more you don't invest in education, the more you are basically signing your own death warrant.
Right.
Because you need the education for people to understand and make their case. So not only understand how they can take advantage of the law and use it to protect themselves and what their rights are and what the rights of other people are, but also so they can actually see how to benefit themselves and other people. If you start reacting to energy shortages or any sorts of resource source by saying, okay, we're just going to divide off you lot and you can go and piss off or whatever, and I'm just going to look after this part, you are creating the grounds in which the law is going to break down, and you are going to really, you're on the road that leads to not just civil war, but a breakdown of law and order. And you need to keep things strong, I think, through education to keep this framework. The question is, what do I learn from looking at 1,000 years of how we've held those in power to account? I do think it comes down to education. It comes down to making them listen. Why should a man in power listen to an uneducated man? well, there are lots of reasons, but it's much easier to persuade the man in power to listen if the man speaking to him is educated.
Right.
So I think this stability in society, the not equality, because that's going too far, but the evenness of treatment across through society, the fairness, I suppose is a better way of putting it, of society is to be encouraged through the twin pillars of education and law.
Right.
So you can't see anything else that's only going to do that. The English got around the problem in the 16th century by going off and conquering places, but that's not possible anymore.
Right. I've talked about that as well. A lot of my viewers, a lot of my community on Twitch, they're varied community that hardly homogeneous. And so you have people living in different countries from different ethnic backgrounds and all that. And I talk about how, like the British Empire, it was vast. At its height, 25% of the world's population basically was under the sway of it. And I said, it's unfortunate that so much of that had to come at the end of a sword. You know, that at the time they couldn't have found more diplomatic ways to export some of their more valuable ideas. But I said, this was also the story of the entire world. Conquest was just the way things happened. And it's certainly not excusable. But this is how...
I would disagree with you on... It's very difficult to talk about the British Empire because so many people come with a moral idea about what empires are, full stop.
Right.
In dinner table discussions, I normally posit the two extremes. The British Empire, which was capable of doing a lot of good. Mm-hmm. If you think in terms of the abolition of slavery throughout Africa, in 1833, the British led the way for every state under its control to abolish slavery. Mm-hmm. I think I could be wrong on one or two exceptions, but I think I'm right in saying that every state that had slavery in 1833 that was not controlled by the British Empire still had it in 1890. Mm-hmm. So what the British Empire was doing was remedying what I would agree was a moral evil in a way that only really an empire could. Mm-hmm. Those individual states saw no reason to do so, and they were quite anti the whole idea of getting rid of abolishing slavery. Mm-hmm. So it could be a force for good. And I think that's a much more responsible attitude than this quasi-empire that we see the Chinese having in Africa at the moment, or the Russians, where there's no empire, there's just military forces making sure that local governments do what's in the interest of the paymasters, or in the case of Chinese, buying up the means of production throughout African states, so that they are able to avail themselves of either the minerals directly or the profits from those minerals. Mm-hmm. Now, they're doing that without any responsibility to the local community. They're taking advantage. Is that sort of unofficial empire any better? No, I don't think it is. I think it's far worse morally because there's no responsibility to the people there. I normally put this sort of two-way thing together just to make people question, is all empire bad? Was the Roman Empire bad? You know, very few people would actually say, oh no, that the Roman Empire was just as bad. They had slavery, they had sacrifices of all sorts of animals and stuff which were cruel, and they conquered places. Let's face it, every bit of the Roman Empire was conquered by the sword, whereas large chunks of the British Empire were conquered by the sword, but large amounts of it were, either fought from the French. In the case of Canada, we fought off the Canadians to keep hold of parts of Canada, or India. Our first settlements in India were as a result of a marriage to Catherine of Braganza, the part of a Portuguese empire. So, I mean, it's a much more complicated thing, but the Romans, definitely the sword. And we have fewer moral judgments about the Roman Empire because the roads, the monuments, the architecture, we can see the benefits and we forget about the slavery and the gladiators and whatever it was.
Oh, yeah. I remember in Latin class, I went to an all-boys private Catholic military school in high school for me, which would have been 9th through 12th grade, 14 through 17. And thankfully, it was not a boarding school. I got to go home and take that lousy uniform off. But in Latin class, they taught us Latin, and it wasn't just Latin. It was, let me tell you a little bit about the Roman Empire. Let me tell you a little bit about how their military worked, and here's how they built a road. So yeah, you see the technological advancements, but then they reminded you, oh yeah, and they killed entire swaths of people to spread all of this. And I think what you're talking about is true. And I'd love to see this idea that you inject into dinner party conversation because it gets people talking. But the idea that you have to wrestle with, I was talking about moral absolutes before. Most of life does not involve moral absolutes. Most of life involves living in a gray area, living in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Christopher Hitchens, may he rest in peace, used to say the measure of a first-class intellect is the ability to hold two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time and still function.
I do. I have heard that quote before, and I'm really pleased you remind me of it.
Yeah. Now I don't know.
I'll tell you.
Yeah, he might have been referencing someone else, so I don't want to. And as I like to say,
no, I think you're right. I think it's
him. I could be wrong and frequently am, but I believe it's true. People. My psychologist used to tell me people want easy. They want things to fit into a neat category and to be tied with a bow, but he says it just doesn't work that way. You've got to be willing to trade in less than absolutes. You've got to be willing to function in a world that is not clearly defined and maneuver through that. And that's what people have always had to do.
Yeah. The reason I'm really pleased you remind me of that Christopher Hitchens quote is because I have a problem on two conflicting points. One is that I would fight for the right of one man, one woman, one vote. I believe in the rule of all. I believe morally there is no alternative. I can understand, and this is as far as I would go, I can understand that there are circumstances in which somebody should have the vote taken away from them. But unless they're a criminal or they don't care or they're negligent and responsible, it's one man, one vote. And that's the only way, be all end of it, I'll fight for it.
Right. On
the other hand, we've had a process of getting more and more people towards that position for the last, since 1832, so 188 years or there are 190 years, and it's delivered us worse and worse governments. When people ask me, who do I think the best Prime Minister of this country, who was the best? I think William Pitt the Younger, who was Prime Minister from 1783 through to 1805, I think it was, before the Great Reform Act, when it was really a matter of a few hundred people really putting him into power. And ultimately, it was just the king who put him into power by the king using his influence. So actually, the best government, in my mind, has been delivered by the worst system. How do I reconcile this? The best government or the best system? Because the two are incompatible, or history has shown the two are incompatible.
Well, then...
that quote about Hitchens just reminds me of... Oh, wonderful. I'm happy about that now.
Well, glad we got something done. But then I guess that would beg the question then. Would that be, to use a modern term, a bug or a feature? Is there a correlation between having a flawed system so that you can rely upon, based on this evidence, we got the best prime minister ever, or was it simply an accident? Was it just this person was an extraordinary human being and they would have been extraordinary no matter what system elected them?
Well, it wasn't an accident. William Pitt the Younger was brought up by his dad, who'd also been prime minister, to be prime minister. And Pitt the Elder, the Earl of Chatham, had him educated really to be prime minister and always believed he would be. It was just extraordinary. He became prime minister at 24 and was enormously successful and popular. But your point is a very good one, because the old system did not always give us the best leaders.
Right.
So in that case, it actually conspired to be a perfect system, to put the perfect man into power. Perfect. Within reason.
Right.
But at the same time, we had some pretty awful prime ministers along the way, delivered by the old system, and also the marginal system we had between the two. And let's face it, when we had complete power in the hands of our monarchs, we had some absolutely bloody dreadful monarchs.
Right.
No prime minister has been as bad as some of our bad monarchs.
Right.
And the prime minister, the monarch who actually tried to stop the whole reform of this country, George IV, who was king between 1820 and 1830, was probably the worst of the lot. Contemporaries, what was along the lines of him, Prince Herman Putnam Muskow described him as the chief actor in a pantomime who deems everyone in the audience infinitely beneath him. And the Times obituary on him read, if the late king ever had a friend, a true friend, in any rank of life, we protest that the name of him or her has yet to reach us.
This, if nothing else, education is necessary to thoroughly disassemble the personage of a dictator. Just to
right.
To articulate what exactly is wrong with a wrong thing. Sometimes you simply need erudition for no other reason than that. I'll never forget, and I've never made it a secret, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but the best takedown, to use another modern word, of Donald Trump was by George Will, who said, it isn't that Donald Trump doesn't know anything, and it isn't that he doesn't know what he doesn't know. It's that Donald Trump doesn't know what it is to know something. And I thought, well, there you have it. But to your point, American historians generally agree that if you're ranking our top presidents, top 5, top 3 are almost always Lincoln, FDR, and George Washington. George Washington is way up there. Now, if you look at the antecedent of every one of those presidents, revolution, bloody revolution, civil war, bloody civil war, and or the modern circumstances of Lincoln. His election was just preceding it, I think. Yeah. And then FDR, depression. So a person might think, well, you just need a really earth-shattering conflagration and by God, we'll get a great leader. It's like, how about we not do that? How about, how about we just get our system in shape?
The equivalent here, of course, would be with the leader through both world wars. I mean, the
Churchill.
Second World War, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
So Winston Churchill wasn't a nice man.
No.
He was a very witty man.
Yeah.
He had character, a bit like our recent Prime Minister, a boring man, Boris Johnson. He had character. He could put across his character. He could entertain people, and he could provide the bon mot that is worth quoting, which frankly is rare in politics these days. And First World War, I mean, we had Lloyd George come out of it, who comes across even today with a good name, even though he wasn't a particularly wonderful character either. You're quite right. The country gets behind its leaders in wartime, which is one of the reasons I'm so worried about what's happening in Russia. Now, who's going to get rid of Putin when everyone's going to get together because Russia's under attack? But there should be enough difficulty in the world for people to come out of peacetime and lack of crisis with some organizing and unifying political talent too. I can't believe it's only in crisis that we can forge a great leader.
Right. They just tend to be more noticeable. They tend to be more necessary. Here's another quote for you. I'll take it from literature. It's nominal literature. It's Ian Fleming. And when he writes, loved Ian Fleming's work. When he wrote about James Bond, he said that, I think Benson was a writer who took over the novels after Fleming, and he wrote about Bond, and he said, Bond has been tortured in every way imaginable, but nothing is so painful to James Bond as ennui, as boredom. And nothing can kind of soften a society and its potential leadership more than things going just fine. And and that's a lot of time how empires tend to crumble as they get soft. They're no longer challenged in existential ways, and they tend to let the side down in just microcosmic ways. And before you know it, crisis. Oh, here comes a leader. Well, where have they been? It's like, you didn't need them. We left it up to you. We left it up to the system, and we just let things. You live in a historic house. If you don't take care of the foundation, then you're going to see some cracks. And, hopefully you don't need a world famous architect to swoop in like a hero and save it. You do the you do
Yeah.
the necessary work in the meantime. I think that's maybe what we miss as a society. It's not sexy, it's not heroic, it's not dramatic, but it's necessary, and it eliminates the need for a great leader to save us.
But at the same time, I mean, coming back also to where we started with the whole Royal Historical Society thing, one of the problems there is that the establishment does not want to be questioned.
Right.
And unless you are constantly testing things,
Yes.
unless you are constantly questioning, it grows complacent, it grows weak, and it can also grow corrupt. When you're talking about, you need that crisis to keep you on the mettle.
Mm-hmm.
You need that to test you all the time, not to grow corrupt, not to grow complacent, not to grow weak.
Mm-hmm.
Institutions themselves can learn from this, not just at national level, but single institutions too. You need that person who's going to be a real pain in the ass, who's going to question you the whole time, just to make sure you do have the answers when it becomes serious.
Yeah. And I think it's true. I'm talking about an ideal situation, but if history has shown us anything, is that crises are inevitable. They are not a bug of the system. They are a feature, and you need a system that can respond to them. And
Yeah.
I think that is what I think your larger point boils down to is the one man, one vote. You have a system that would ideally give everyone a chance to have a voice. And if that system is taken care of, perhaps an education, because it sustains itself, it replenishes itself, it's turning over new soil. Just as a feature of its existence, we make sure that each generation has a grasp of history, has the ability to think critically, and nurtures it, thinks of it as a necessity of civilization.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I thank my lucky stars I had the education I had, because it's empowered me to do whatever I want. No one tells me what to do. I live in a wonderful house and in the part of the world where I want to live, and I do what I want for a moment. And I wouldn't have that if it hadn't been for an education. My parents made great sacrifices for my education, which was an expensive one. And I was lucky in also winning a scholarship, and then on top of that, my own hard work. So through those three things, I've managed to benefit, and I am grateful every day for the education.
Right. Yeah, to put a button on that, I know that in England, they have I don't know how much it's changed, but it's always been my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a very rigid class system in England as well. And it can be very hard to be upwardly mobile unless you do something extraordinary. Otherwise, you're kept in check. And
This is a myth.
yes. And so a lot of people look and they see the superficial. They think, well, it looks to me like you've got everything. It must have been handed to you. And that's just not necessarily the case. Some people have, for sure. I mean, you have the peerage. But as in the United States, very often outward appearances are deceiving. A person has gotten to where they've gotten to, not necessarily because the road has been paved for them. Frequently, there have been more obstacles than a person can suspect.
The class system in England is difficult to understand.
Yeah.
Even if you live here, because you see it as it is at the moment. It isn't rigid. It is extraordinarily flexible. It allows enormous social mobility. And to give you an example of this, I have an alternative take on how people should do their family trees.
Mm-hmm.
When I was little, when I was like 9, 10, I was obsessed by family history.
Mm-hmm.
So I traced all my family ancestors way back. Now, it only occurred to me when I was then thinking through, about 10 years ago, thinking through different ways of different perspectives on what a family is.
Mm-hmm.
I came up with a different idea of a family tree, which isn't a long line of father, son, which always prioritizes the patrilineal line and the possession of property. I thought, okay, I've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and what about, rather than looking at one of those lines, which always, as I say, highlights the male, look along all the 3 great-grandparents. So all my great-great-great-grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
None of them knew each other. They all lived in different parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So, all living in different parts of southern England. They were all alive at more or less the same time. The earliest marriage was 1811, and the last one was 1856. Now, what will I learn from actually looking at their lives and seeing what happened to them? And there's a real range in there. You know, some died in childbirth, some lived to be old women. What I really learned was that of those 32 people, 28 of them were working class.
Mm-hmm.
No one would describe me as working class. I was privately educated. I have a good income. I'm a member of a London club. I know I can get on with anybody at whichever part of society.
Right.
I know how to behave in formal company. I don't necessarily. I can go along and sing in the local pub with the local folk song. So
right.
No one would sort of say that I'm trapped by this at all. But looking back at my ancestors, over time, the class system is very flexible.
Mm-hmm.
Our mistake is, and the myth comes from seeing things as they are right at the moment and who can talk to whom.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just look at things as a present moment thing, yeah, we've got a strict class system. We've got a really pretty offensive class system, you've asked me. But over time, that is a malleable thing. And that's true even in our own lifetimes. You don't have to look over 6 generations to see this, because people can elevate themselves. I'm often amused by the path of pop stars through our system. So, you have people like Mick Jagger or Elton John, who are not privileged by birth, but end up being multimillionaires, knights of the realm, living in wonderful residences with basically all the privileges that anybody could possibly want, still working for their money if they want to. I mean, we actually elevate in much the same way as America does, or most of the Western world. We elevate people from sometimes very humble origins. But in the UK, of course, since we've got all these trappings of an honours system, we loaded all the honours onto the rich people too, which so you end up benefiting each way. So, I mean, anybody who marries a knight of the realm becomes automatically Lady so-and-so. So that could be anybody. She doesn't necessarily have to be a high achiever in her own right. So we have all this sort of fuzziness around our class system. And over time, even in one lifetime, you can go from the very, very bottom to the very, very top.
Right.
Can I just tell you my favourite story about this?
Sure.
There was a woman called Harriet Mellon, who I bet you'd never heard of.
No, I have not.
You would not. Virtually nobody's heard of her. In 1830, she was about the richest woman in this country. She was a duchess, and she was born at completely the opposite end of the social spectrum. She was the illegitimate daughter of a travelling Irish woman who made her money from, made her living from helping travelling actors going between pubs. Mm-hmm. She was born into this sort of basically lower than working class itinerant existence. But through the stage, she got herself a name. She got together with Thomas Coutts, who was a banker. When he died, he left his controlling interest in the bank to her. She then operated the largest private bank in England at the time. She then married a duke who was 18 years younger than her or something. So when she died, she was not only the richest woman in the country, one of the 5 richest people in the country, she was a duchess, and she just went from one extreme all the way through to the other in the space of one lifetime. So yes, it's a very strict system in the here and now, but over time, it's a very flexible one.
Gotcha. Now, do you think that flexibility is mainly something that is demonstrated when you have an extraordinary individual that is able to supersede a class system? Or do you think that the class system, just by its nature, would allow somebody that doesn't even have to be extraordinary, but simply perhaps a harder worker than average, a little smarter than average, a little more industrious than average, something that reflects a true malleability of a system? Or do you have to be a Robbie Williams, an Elton John, in order to transcend?
Okay. When I look around here, I mean, there's, as I say, I use this community as my big laboratory for understanding time. There's a family not far from here called Fulford family. Mm-hmm. They've basically occupied the same patch of land since the 12th century. Mm-hmm. They haven't moved away. They've always stayed in the same house, on the same site, since the 12th century. If you stay there, you build up assets, you gain wealth.
Mm-hmm.
The wealth you had to begin with is relatively more wealth than people are coming into the world, as we were talking about earlier, and therefore you become more important. Therefore, you attract other people who want to marry you and bring your heir and bring in more wealth. They have got really relatively wealthy. I mean, they're not super wealthy, but they're multimillionaires. They've got that wealth simply by staying on the same spot for 800 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the current gentleman who owns the house, Fulford House, last time I spoke to him, he said he was planting oaks because he's got lots of forest.
Right.
He's planting oaks for harvesting in 190 years' time, to be cut down for timber in 190 years by his great-great-great-great-grandchildren.
Right.
That long-sightedness means that you don't need to be remarkable, you're just going to be tenacious. On the other hand, I look at how all my ancestors have come together. Well, that was just each generation, they were trying to get up a little bit more up the ladder.
Right.
And so each generation, each one of them found attractive the people who were also trying to get up the ladder. Mm-hmm. So gradually, from all these parts of the country, people were engaged on a sort of social climbing that brought them all together. Mm-hmm. And the longer it carried on, the greater the benefits were going to be to the next generation. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you need to be extraordinary. I do think you need to have the will to make your life a better one. Mm-hmm. I think the willingness, the willpower is where it comes from. And if you look at all the self-made men up and down and self-made women up and down the country, so often you realise they've got something unusual. And that unusualness is a deep drive.
Right.
Either for their art or their business, or they don't want to be poor. Or just thinking one businessman I can think of, had left school with nothing at the age of 16, but damn well wasn't going to be poor, so just worked really, really hard at building a successful business.
Right.
So I think the system is very amenable to those who really want it.
Right.
But no one gets anything given to them on a plate.
No. I'm reminded of a saying when you talked about the planting oaks. The idea of a society will flourish when men plant trees, the shade under which they know they will never sit. Yes. And so you have to think in terms of time. And who better than a historian to point that out? You have to think in terms of perspective. You were here at this point in time, but because of the advantages of time and persistence and forward thinking, your descendants will be at an elevated position. And I think just about any parent thinks in those terms. Whatever life I have, I want my children's life to be better, or at least as good. And my wife and I frequently talk about this. We know that the life we are currently enjoying is an improvement over what our parents were able to enjoy. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we're educated, and so we can make wiser choices.
I mean, the more I think about it, and as you're speaking, I'm thinking about more examples. I mean, the richest landowner in the country at the moment is Duke of Westminster. His money, Grosvenor family, his money really comes from a marriage they made in the early 17th century when they made their eldest son marry an orphan girl who was the heiress of the manor of basically what is now West London. Mm-hmm. So automatically the family acquired large amounts of land, which then was just stinking marsh. Right. But 150 years later became the most valuable real estate in England, if not in Europe. Yeah. So, and that's why they're worth billions to this day. That far-sightedness. Yeah. That's what makes. We don't all have to be on the lookout like that, but that far-sightedness is what constantly and permanently can enrich a family. Right. Yeah, and I think just the ability to think in terms of small steps that will lead to payoffs down the road is integral to not just a person living to their potential, but to a society. But unless you understand the system and historically how important it is, you won't do that. And I guess that's where we're in lockstep, where we see the big problem right now is that we're trying to warn people that you don't want the person that says they're going to burn everything down. This is exactly right. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
You need calmness, compromise, reasonableness, fairness. How do you vote those things in? Dodgy.
Yeah, I noticed that you just announced on Twitter that you're going to mothball your account
I have,
because,
yeah. That was
yeah,
yesterday.
you see the way that it is trending. And
Yeah.
Bill Maher, is a talk show host here in the United States, had a guest, Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, which I think is a
Of course,
fascinating
yeah.
book. Yeah. And
Well, yeah, yeah, okay.
okay, no, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I start off my next book with a major line of criticism about *Sapiens*.
Okay, no, I okay. If you want to reserve it for your book, that's fine.
No. I'll come into it back to you. But you were saying
Okay,
you finish your point, and I'll come back on *Sapiens*.
right. Maher is sort of a champion of Elon Musk. I'm on the fence about him. I think he's done things that are a net positive. He believes in climate change, is working to try to correct it. Space travel is extremely important to the survival of our species, things like that. But he does things that are not. Bill Maher said, well, Twitter is the public square. And Harari said, it's not the public square. It's not the town square. It's the gladiators' arena. It rewards extremism. It rewards aggression and outrage. The town square is where you have a critical discussion. You come to a consensus. You make an informed decision. Everyone agrees, and then you walk away, the community having been better for it. That's not what happens on Twitter. And so,
I
yeah,
agree with that absolutely.
right.
And yeah, I don't want to do Harari down because he says many sensible things as well.
Yeah.
And on that particular point, I mean, we were talking earlier about the echo chamber, and I don't see. I see the divisiveness of Twitter getting worse and worse and worse.
Yes.
The echo chamber effect getting worse. I don't really see that is going to help anybody.
Right.
This is not town square, and you're quite right. It's Harari's quite right. It is a bullying zone. And do I want to be associated with that? No, even if I'm not part of the bullying,
Right.
or if I don't feel bullied, because I follow relatively few people, and I don't respond to anybody who sends me antagonistic lines. So
Right.
I don't feel I'm part of the problem, and I don't feel I'm adversely affected by the problems. I avoid it, but still, it's part of a shift in our psyche that people think this is the way forward. Or I just think, no, I'm going to stop the echo chamber effect by getting off social media altogether. And that's the only way I do, Twitter. I think what I'll do is actually just write more for my own website and sort of get more of a sort of shorter, more regular update through my own website of what I'm doing, and then try and find some way that people can feed back to me if they want to. At the moment, that's not possible, but we'll sort that out. But going into Harari, Harari, I mean, that book *Sapiens* is, I think, the best-selling history book ever. I mean, I know it's gone past 12 million sales. I think it's the best-selling history book in the history of the world. It succeeds in a large part because he works with his audience's assumptions and presumptions. And the best example of this is the start of chapter 14, I think it is. He basically says, at the start of chapter 14, if a peasant from the year 1000 were to fall asleep and wake to the sound of Columbus's sailors preparing to set sail across the Atlantic in 1492, he would have felt quite at home. You know, things have happened along the way and borders have changed, but otherwise life would have been very familiar. He would have felt at home. If he'd fallen asleep again, or if one of those sailors had fallen asleep and woken up in the 21st century to the sound of an iPhone ringtone, he would have thought, am I in heaven or hell? That's more or less what he says in the first paragraph of that chapter. And he's working with people's assumptions about technology. That technology has changed, and where we feel familiar is due to technology. Contrasting the lack of technological change between 1000 and 1492 and 1492 and now. And that's what people want to read. They want to see that technology is all-powerful because technology can redeem so many of our problems. So he's playing into paradigms that people want to believe, even though people like me come along and say they're not true. Now, basically, that's the launch part for my next book, Perceptions of the Past and Perspective on the Past. So I say, really, in response, and in fact, in the introduction of my book, I said, well, is the iPhone really that much more important to you than your individual freedom? Would you be happy being a slave as long as you can keep your iPhone? The disproportionate level to which he highlights technology in that one passage, in fact, from then on to the rest of the book, is, I think, really misleading. And I think it's a bad book because of what he's so glibly putting forward as the major changes in the last 500 years. There are lots of good points in the book and lots of points at which it makes you think again. But that one was my point of departure for saying, you, Harari, a professor of medieval history, are misleading people about what was happening in the first half of the last millennium. For a start, that sailor who fell asleep in 1000 and woke to Columbus's sailors getting ready, or that peasant who fell asleep and woke to Columbus's sailors getting ready, that's Palos de la Frontera. It was a Muslim country in 1000. By 1492, Muslims were being hounded out of the country and persecuted or first forced to convert. Now, he would not have felt at home. Because you're working with your audience's presumptions, and that's a big force to work with, you are overlooking the reality of the past. And that's where whether you call it misinformation or disinformation, that's where it starts to get dangerous. And I feel that historians can do better than that.
Right. Well, that's a fair point then. And I look forward to hopefully you and Professor Harari having a conversation about this, because you are directly challenging a thesis of his book. And, you know, and since I'm all for critical debate, I'd love to see how that unfolds. I can't claim to know the book chapter and verse, so I can, you know, I tell you what, I could pose this question then. The one thing I do know he discusses, and I'd love to hear your take on this, is the ascendance of technology in this regard, that we are now merging technology with our own bodies, literally, to the degree where, you know, for a while we've had pacemakers. We now can wear Fitbits as a runner, I'm sure you know, and we'll have to save the running for another conversation. Yeah, you can monitor your functions at any given time. AI is a better diagnostician of what is wrong with the body than a personal doctor is, because it simply doesn't, it's just more accurate. And yet it doesn't mean that a person doesn't want a personal doctor. We need them for a variety of reasons. What do you think of his idea that we are more and more becoming merged with technology, and that it is fundamentally changing who we might be as people? And I don't want to misrepresent. I believe that that's a position he's putting forward in the book.
And I think there's lots of levels at which you could agree with that.
Okay, yeah.
And there was one day, I don't normally use a mobile phone. I have one for emergencies, and that's it. No one has the number. So basically, I use it for checking email when I'm away from home, but literally no one has the number. Mm-hmm. So I came out of I was walking along street in London, and I saw people coming out of a theatre at interval time, droves of them, all doing exactly the same thing as soon as they got out.
Right.
Now, some of them had good reason for checking their mobile phone, so much as they wanted to check on the babysitter or something like that.
Right.
But you've got this sense with all these people just pouring out in the foyer, all checking their mobile phone at the same time because they hadn't been able to for the last probably hour and a half, that they are dependent on it. They have become dependent on a piece of technology.
Yes.
Now, I think that in microcosm is what we are seeing happening very, very rapidly, that people are feeling dependent. And of course, once you take away the thing on which they're dependent, they often don't know how to revert. They can't just go back. Right. Now, the mobile phone is probably quite easy to revert because take it away, people start to lose that anxiety. But so many of these things you're talking about are difficult to revert. We could not go back to a paper-based government social system now.
No.
We are dependent on technology. Mm-hmm. If you were to pull the plug on so many aspects of our lives, you would not be able to rebuild the non-technological, non-computerized basis for it. So I think we therefore moving into a world in which we are dependent on technology, and whoever controls that technology makes themselves not omnipotent, but all-powerful to all those dependents. I think he has a good point there. Mm-hmm. But where I would come back and argue is to say that the expectations and the hopes we have in our lives are still very much dependent on the the sort of mentality we developed in the wake of the Black Death, which is you can see developing through the 14th century with the ideas about what the self is, ideas of individualism, the development of the mirror, the idea that you have a picture of yourself rather than just think you are a functionary. So you can see yourself like your early medieval ancestors couldn't. That self which we see arising in the 16th century through the invention of the diary and the autobiography, which is all complete by 1600. It's all there by 1600. I think that sensibility and what it is to be an individual in the Western world, I don't think that is likely to change. Now, I could be wrong, but all sorts of technology have not yet changed that. Technology has changed our lives in so many ways. Around here, I'm constantly haunted by the towns that were basically denuded of their young people through the invention of the railways 200, best part of 200 years ago, when all the lifeblood was sucked out of these communities.
Right.
Technology changed society hugely. But has it changed what we are and what we hope for and our ideas about freedom? And who would say that they live for technology? Who would say that what makes their life meaningful is technology? I don't think that many people would, if anybody. And if they did say that technology is what they lived for, they would be beyond geekness, they would be beyond nerdiness, they would probably have something wrong with them. For us, technology is a means to an end. And we might become dependent on that. And that's where I would agree with him. But I don't think that's the purpose for why we live or we want to carry on living. And that's where I would say that he's concentrating on something that's less important and losing the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting in the book I'm publishing. I don't outright ask it, but I know the theme of it is who are we? Who am I? And this soldier who's being placed in different battles to fight, he's encountering historical figures who are doing what everyone does, asking themselves that question. He encounters Ethelflaed, the warrior queen, and
Right.
she was pushing against the boundaries of a patriarchal society that didn't even want to give her the title of queen. And so he sees her asking herself, how am I going to transcend this? And yes, I can see very much so that no matter what we encounter, our basically what is universal in all of us is the idea that we must know who we are. And you can't know that by sitting still. You must go out into the world, experience it. Technology can only aid you in that, but it doesn't determine everything about it. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, we have to remain, we have to find a way to use it, but not be ruled by it.
In the book, I actually posit that the idea that isn't a universal truth before the 13th century, really, because so subjectified, so enslaved was even the common man in England. So we're talking about 85% of the population here in the 11th century were unfree, in that if they weren't slaves, they were serfs, villains of some sort or other, boarders, cotters. They did not have the freedom to leave their place of birth. They did not have the freedom to choose who they married. They did not have the freedom to enlarge or better themselves, enlarge their estates or better themselves. They were 85% unfree. Now, in that community where everybody is pulling together for the sake of the community, the reason it developed was basically survival. People are facing famine every fourth year, so everybody has to pull together like a machine to maximize the chances of survival. I'm not sure that they had a concept of individuality which we would recognize, or an independence of thinking that we would recognize. I think their idea of self was pretty much their community. And what they took pride and shame from was what was beneficial to the community and what was horrific to the community. And the ideas that we think are universal, of the individual, of freedom and independence of thinking, are really something that comes out of the breakdown of that system over the course of the Middle Ages, and which reaches its, it hugely amplified by the Black Death, freeing up so much capital for people to run away from their enslavement, serfdom rather, and to become people who could better themselves in lots of ways. The freedom that society experienced after the Black Death, I think, is responsible for a lot of our ways of thinking, which we haven't let go of yet. But I can imagine that if society is forced back into a unfree world, an unfree thinking, where all you've got to do is pull together to survive, we would lose our ideas of thinking like we do now. And we would become much more like the Saxon peasant, just working as a group on the same bit of land, day in, day out, all your life, following orders until you drop.
Right.
So I'm not sure that what we think of as of universal truths through time are necessarily the same. But of course, it's always very difficult to move psychologically away from our own point in time and think about these people we can't actually interview and find out how they really thought.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess you can make educated guesses. I mean, in my research for my first book, I did encounter the idea that your typical Anglo Saxon barely ever met anyone outside of their village. I mean, if they were a traveling merchant, they might, but for the most part, you stayed where you were. Yeah, exactly. That was a feature of life then. And yeah, I could certainly see the point that Renaissance and Enlightenment values were perhaps a product of the ability to have that thought process, because I personally think the idea of who am I is endemic to everyone with the consciousness. However, you might live in a system that answers that question for you from birth so that you're never encouraged to consider it. Or when it does enter your mind, you immediately know, oh, you're a vessel for this. You're a cipher for that. That's all you are. Now,
yeah, I agree with you. Yeah,
get back outside. The crops aren't going to take care of themselves. Yes. So, yeah, it is interesting to see that arc, and I could understand how somebody with an empty belly doesn't have much time to think about who they are.
No.
No. This has always been the irony to me, but again, it's two conflicting ideas residing in my noggin. I'm using technology to try to tell as many people as possible that they really need to take more of a break from it. And on the one hand, I'm talking to you and your background is all books. Mine is animation cells. So but I think a good idea is still a good idea. And I think it's a good idea to give yourself more periods of calm and quiet where you're not bombarded by noise. And this leads me to something that you have a background in, and I had a background in as a kid, and then I moved away from it for a while. I was a pretty good runner as a kid. And yet I hated it. But I could run a mile in about 5.5 minutes when I was around 14, 15 years ago. And that's not bad. That's not bad. I despised it, though, because I was running at nearly a miler runs at about 80% full speed and it's just an unmerciful period of time. But I was good at it. But when I got into 5Ks, we call them 5Ks here, I imagine you might call them that there. 3.1 miles. You can hit a little bit more of a rhythm, be alone with your thoughts and not think about, I've got to beat my time. And you can sort of enter almost a state of grace. And if you're running for longer periods than that, you are alone with your thoughts if you choose not to take your ear pods and blast music into your head. And so the idea of there's a phrase used on the internet quite a bit among video gamers, touch grass. In other words, you're playing this game too much, go outside and touch grass. So I'd love to hear that you have written, have you not written a book on this, the importance of running? Okay.
Yeah, why running matters.
Okay, so please enlighten us as to why running matters.
You mentioned about getting away from it. I mean, going back to Harari, he spends, I think, an hour a day meditating as a matter of course. Mm-hmm. And I was interested when I read about that. I don't need to do that for two reasons. One, I spend a lot of time here by myself. I haven't got students to lecture to or anything like that. So I have plenty of time just to think, and I go into my library. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I just pick up a book at random and just start reading something that's going to take me away from the mental loop that I'm in at that time. And I come back and it's almost like I've had a holiday or I've had a drink or something. And it's refreshing. So I do that anyway. But the other reason is exercise. And for me, both running and walking are really important in this respect. I wasn't a good runner as a kid. I was okay, but not good. And then I took it up in my 40s and realized actually was pretty okay at it for somebody my age. Mm-hmm. On the mile, I was still under 6 minutes in my 50s. So
that's excellent.
I was able to keep a reasonable speed going for my age.
Yeah.
And then I got interested in running further and what the meaning of it would be.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2015, we have, I don't know if you've come across park runs yet, which are 5K runs.
Mm-hmm.
Every Saturday here, all throughout the country. There's several hundred of them in England. There's a few in the States. But it's free 5K for anybody who wants to turn up at 9 o'clock and get an official time at the end of it. And I started doing park runs in 2015. And I said to my then youngest son, I said to the whole family at dinner, who's going to come to park run with me and join me on what is actually a fairly hilly, muddy, rocky, difficult route. And I was expecting a big chorus of no's around the table. So my wife and 3 children. And my youngest son said, yes, I'll come and join you. And that was, 7 years ago now. And he carried on coming to every run with me every Saturday. And he's not a fast runner, not at all. He's slow, but he's determined. And the practice of the two of us running together really made me think about this whole meaning of running with my son. And especially when my other son then joined us as well, who's older, who was that time, he's 4 years older than all of us, so he'd have been 19. And I started realizing that what I was doing was imbuing in them a sense of the value of what they do as physically. What they physically do has value. And I taught them all from growing up that what they do intellectually has value. I taught them about education, how every qualification you get is a currency that you can never end up spending. You can spend it as often as you want and you'll never run out. And then I realized that the introducing them to running was actually doing the same thing. They always would know they could run. They always knew how they could improve themselves physically. And it just became this thing. So all these mantras started coming out of it. And the one that gets frequently cited is, no run is ever wasted. So you might go out on an 8-mile run and you have to stop after 6 because of whatever. Your leg hurts but it's not wasted. You did 6 miles.
Right.
Every run has value. And it's this whole idea of improving yourself through taking a positive attitude towards yourself physically became a big thing. That then developed in Why Running Matters into this book, which was written in the year I turned 50, so 5 years ago. And I simply described what I learned from running in every run I did. And then I honed it down from January to December. And I honed it down to the best bits all the way through. So there were things there about what I learned about the marriage and the tenacity of working with things and patience and allowing people to do their own separate thing. You learn all sorts of things from running. I managed to injure myself in the course of the year as well, and I had to go through this period when I couldn't run, which, if you're a runner, is far harder than running.
Yeah.
There was a bit with my youngest son when I did a 5K in less than 20 minutes the first time, and he wasn't with me at the time. He saw what I'd done on the result sheet at the end, and he phoned me up at my office, which he's never done. He's never done it before. He never did it since. But he phoned me up to congratulate me because he knew what it would mean to me. So this whole idea of what new set of meanings, it's like you're opening a door to a whole new set of meanings in your life by doing this. So it's not just physical, it's emotional, it's good for your spirit. You discover more meaning in life, in short.
Right. And I when I rediscovered 5Ks, it was in my 40s. And I'm not sure what brought me there, but I am a big believer in the idea of self-improvement. In fact, my wife, when she met me, said that one of the things she liked most about me was that I was always trying to be a better person, and that I would get things wrong, but I'm much more interested in a positive arc to my life. And you can't just do that mentally. Your body is one of the 2 tools you get. You get your body, you get your mind. What are you going to do with them? And running is about the most personal thing you can choose to do. It's also perhaps one of the very first things we've learned to do as a species, and a marvelous expression of what the body is capable. But the idea of 20 minutes for a 5K was on my radar because when I was about 16,
Good target, isn't it?
oh, it's not easy at all, sir. When I was 16, I was done with being on the track team because I wasn't good enough to win points. My team was just too competitive. But I ran a 5K as a lark and ran it in about 20 and a half minutes. And then as I'm in my 40s, I'm thinking, I'm in pretty good shape. I go out and run a 5K. I do it in about 23, 24. Again, not a disgrace. But I'm sitting here thinking, I know I can do better than that. But I hit about 22 and a half, and I did it at my neighborhood at the time. The 5K involved hills. And so it's not a flat 5K. And I've since had to amend that and say, if you're ever going to try and reach the 20-minute barrier, you're going to have to do it on a flat piece of land.
Flat. Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, it is not easy. And my doctor would ask me, are you going to do the 5K again this year? Because it's usually something I would do 2 or 3 times a year at most. And he knew that I was pushing myself. And you talked about injury. And I remember he would tell me, he says, I want you to be careful, because he's a sports medicine specialist. He works with Major League Baseball here in the States and things like that. And he said, I want you to be careful because you're at an age where you'll injure yourself and then you can't exercise at all. And so I started to think of the idea of, you know what, maybe I shouldn't push it too far, because then it becomes counterproductive, because then you lose the ability to just go out and run anytime. And so it becomes, and this is more of a feature of being in my 50s. I'm 53. So I don't want to, what I've learned is from being in pretty good state of fitness, it's a push-pull. I currently have an intercostal muscle sprain on my 12th rib, or it's a strain. It's not too bad. He looked at it and he says, yeah, it's going to take you 2 or 3 months to get over this. And even after you're over it, every now and then you're going to feel it. And I realized this is the challenge. You don't necessarily have to do what you did when you were younger, but you do have to engage in the act of exercise and pushing yourself within reasonable bounds. It just changes. That window changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know why. I got very good bones. I had it tested, but I do have a propensity to get stress fractures. So I've had 5 stress fractures over the course from running. Over the course of the last 10 years. And it's a real bugger every single time, because you've got to give up for 10 weeks, 12 weeks, no serious exercise. And I think I actually got one again now, so I'm taking it really easily. But there was one year, it was in 2017, because I wrote about it in the book, and I decided simply to think, right, I'll look at this as a learning process. And I will not exercise at all for 12 weeks, and I will see if I can run a marathon simply by thinking my way around it when it comes to it. So I was in the pub the night beforehand, and a friend of mine said to me, there's no way you're going to do it under 2 hours if you haven't been doing any training and for 12 weeks, or any exercise for 12 weeks. And I thought, well, you probably can. I'll have a go. And
wait, 2 hours or 3 hours? Because 2 hours is a world record.
No, that's half marathon.
Oh, half marathon. Okay.
Half marathon.
Okay, yeah. I thought you were saying full-on marathon.
Serious marathons. So, I mean, normally I was running half marathon in 1:38, 1:39.
Okay.
And so I had to then think, can you do it without any training in the 12 weeks beforehand?
Gotcha.
And if you can you basically pace yourself well enough? And I mean, in the course of it, I got almost overtaken by somebody in a giant bird costume, which was really embarrassing.
That's a nice ego check. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing like running to keep you humble.
Yeah.
But I did it in under the 2 hours, and I can remember thinking it's because I'd run so many in the past. I'd run loads of them in the past, so I was able to pace myself, able to think about all the adversity, cope with the adversity, and the training came not just from the physicality, it came from having done it lots beforehand, knowing what I was doing. And now it is with, I feel I've got another stress fracture. I haven't therefore run for the last, since Monday before last. And okay, this is something I've got to deal with, something I've just got to work around. Am I going to stop running? No, there's no way. I'm going to work how I get back into running soon without damaging myself permanently.
Right.
But I've had this sort of injury before. I know what it's going to involve. It's going to take a long time out from running. I'm going to have to do a lot of walking in the meantime. And when I get back to it, then I'm not going to have this real problem of getting back up fit quickly to where I want to be when I'm going from nothing. And that's going to be difficult itself, because that's when you injure yourself again. So, okay, I know all this now. I'll work with it. I'm not going to follow the advice that says, oh, it's damaging you, you should stop. I'm going to work around everything I know about how we get around these problems, because I'm buggered if I'm not going to carry on running now.
Right. There's so much
built into my routines.
Right. I don't think there is a doctor worth their salt that would tell someone, yeah, it's best not to exercise. You get injured. There are too many ways to exercise. Like in my case, I don't get stress fractures, but I do get, oddly enough, I get cysts. So I remember, I would get, let's see, I got on my Achilles, I would have this little bump. My doctor looked at it and says, yeah, we call it a pump bump. A lot of women from wearing pumps, they get these bumps on their Achilles because it's just a little bit of tension or pressure that's there. And over time, it can express as a cyst. Some people get them, some people don't. So I have the kind of body that I have a cyst underneath the arch. I have high arches on my feet. So I get cysts underneath on the arches underneath my feet. They're not painful or anything, but they're there. And he says, if I were to remove that, I would just give you scar tissue and it makes it worse. So he said, you learn your body, you learn its limits, you learn what it excels at, you learn what it might have a problem with. And you say, the end game here is to get my heart rate up in a way that I enjoy. So I'll do it consistently. Nobody's going to do something consistently that they don't enjoy, so that I can get the attendant health benefit and, of course, the mental benefit. I mean, there's a release of endorphins. There's a chance to enter a meditative state. You can even problem solve areas of your life that have nothing to do with running, by simply looking at them from a different point of view. So we have a machine called a tonal, a bit of technology, and it uses pulleys and it uses digital weight to provide weight resistance. I can use the tonal to work my body and build muscle, which allows my body to process glucose better, process insulin better. So my overall lab work numbers are improved. And then if I have an impact problem with cysts on my feet, or if I get aches on my heels because I'm too tight in my calves, I can get on the exercise bike we have, get my heart rate up without impact trauma. So I would prefer to do something out in nature, because there's just something much more blissful, not to idealize it too much. I'd rather be in nature going on a nice walk than sitting in front of a screen and doing it, but I do it as the occasion warrants.
Likewise, I have an exercise bike and I avoid it, though I think I'll have to do something on it soon, because I can't really keep up my fitness unless I do. So I will have to eat humble pie and get on it soon. But I know the running thing. A lot of people do say, "Oh, avoid running because of an impact thing," or you should do cycling. They say because it's so much better for your bones. But no, I'm of the mind that you know your body, you work around the problems, you work around the limitations,
right?
And if you do have a problem, well, if you've got enough experience, you will work around that problem too. And in my case, I have got the problem. I have probably got a stress fracture. I will work through it, and I will find a way of getting back to running again sooner rather than later. And it's a long time since I've run a 20-minute 5K, but I haven't given up on it yet, and I'm 55.
Now, when did you run your 20-minute 5K? Was that just before you hit 50?
My fastest was 1947, so that was when I was 49 years of age.
All right, and that's right around when I was hitting. I think I was 50. It was pre-pandemic, but I hit my peak time right around then, and there was, to me, much with you, there was a strategy involved. I told myself, based on the terrain, I've got to do the first mile in this. The second mile is almost entirely uphill, so it's just going to eat my lunch for me. And it's a question of at that point, not letting too much out the door. in other words, in losing my time. The last mile is nearly even. And then, as anyone who runs a 5K knows, that last zero point 0.1 mile is a sprint. It's got to be a sprint. And a little bit of math comes into play, and I'm thinking, all right, I've got to do X, Y, and Z. I've got to approach this strategically. Now, of course, on the day, if you forget that and you let adrenaline take over, you realize, oh, my pace is off. So am I going to be able to power through this, or do I have to keep myself under control here? That's a lot to do over 20 minutes.
Yeah. But that last bit, I always think about the last stage of a half marathon, which is 13.1 miles.
Yeah.
And that last 0.1, which is the bit you haven't timed for, basically, when you're counting multiple per mile. You've done the maths, and you, of course, weren't counting that 0.1. You realise you're not going to hit your target because you forgot about the 0.1 of the mile at the end of it.
Yeah.
That's a frequent frustration. I count in kilometres now because it's just so much easier with all these runs to count in kilometres, and then you won't have that nasty sting in the tail, as it were, from the 0.1 at the end.
Yeah.
Well, you're trying to do a certain time.
I also think what people underestimate, because I frequently talk to people that tell me, I talk to video gamers a lot, and they're people who spend a lot of time in front of screens, and a lot of it is because their circumstances have pushed them there. A lot of them are in less than ideal circumstances, and they don't have the opportunity to do much else, or at least that is what their belief is. I try to tell them, you can exercise in a lot of ways. You don't have to be outside. If you're at a screen, you can stop, and in 5 minutes, you can do a series of isometric or calisthenic exercises. Work with what you have. But one thing I try to impart to people, maybe I don't do it enough, is the elation you feel after your exercise. Very often, I have a friend I play softball with. He says, I ran about 12 or 13 marathons, and I hated every single one of them. But man, did I feel good when they were done. And that's what brought him back to the next one, that sense of achievement, that I did something I didn't think I could do. And
the line in Why Running Matters is that there's nothing that gives you a stronger idea, a stronger perception of the difference between happiness and satisfaction in running.
Yes. And that's a larger philosophical point as well. We talk about, like, Saturdays when I do coffee and donuts on my stream, a lot of it is devoted to just mental health ideas. How do we keep ourselves in balance? Because I can talk about happiness, but it's not as important to me as the idea of keeping my life in a state of balance. Not too high, not too low, because I find immense satisfaction and contentment comes from that. And a person who is content is sometimes seen as someone who becomes lazy because they have what they want. I actually find contentment in knowing that I'm continuously pushing myself outside of a comfort zone.
You sound like me in that case.
And so and this is something my therapist beat into my brain. He says, you're not going to get happy sitting on the couch. All right. You can't think yourself into it. You have you've got to make yourself uncomfortable. Comfort will kill you. You have got to push yourself. And so, philosophically speaking, I would much rather be satisfied than happy. And it's a semantic idea. But
it's something through running. It's very easy to show people the difference. They don't necessarily immediately grasp this difference, but I mean, marathons are interesting on the happiness bit because the end of a marathon is hell for everybody. Let's face it, you run 26 miles. Yeah. No one enjoys the last stages of a marathon, but the feeling when you've stopped is fantastic. And because you've paced yourself, the first half is really enjoyable too, because you're running well within your capabilities for the first half. So unless you've done something stupid, then the first half is about as of our marathons, about as enjoyable as running can be, because you're running so much within your capabilities, because you're prepared to run twice as far. So that end bit, that real tough bit, is not a moment of happiness. The satisfaction at the end of it, though, makes it all worthwhile, and also the satisfaction of the fact you can do it. Right. It's just knowing you can do it. I think it so often is the most satisfying thing of all. Right.
And I think that concept writ large can give a person an idea of what a life can be. There is, I mean, if you think back to your university days and how they must have heaped so much study upon you in order to get to where you've gotten. I mean, the amount of work you probably had to do to reach your degrees and to achieve even beyond that, doctorates and things. I once knew somebody who was getting a master's degree, and they said nobody is happy getting a master's degree, getting your thesis done and all that. They make it where you think it's not even possible to do it, but you get it done.
We have a very different system here from America, where it's all self-motivation.
Okay.
So no one was telling me ever to do anything. It's all a matter of me doing it, and me wanting to do it, and me choosing to do it. And to be honest, my reading has always been so eclectic and so natural. I've never really, in intellectual terms, I've never had to work hard, as it were, because I've just done it. That's what I do. It is like going for a run. It's what I do. It's so no, I have to say I have not worked hard.
Okay.
I work long hours, frequently work a 100-hour week, but I don't actually work hard because it's not work. It's just reading.
Well, this sort of pivots to the idea of what we do. My uncle used to tell me, the psychologist used to tell me, don't be an artist, you are one. You don't have to work at it. It's who you are. And so, I'm a voice actor by trade. There are very few moments when I'm actually in, and I have a booth right here at home, a professional booth for recording. There have been very few moments where I've been in a booth recording for a project where I thought it was actual work. That I thought, I can't believe they're paying me to talk into this can. And well, I might add. And when you meet someone who actually does work, you see the ravages of it. You see it on their face, you see it in their body language, you see that they have put hours on the clock, and when they come home, they want to do anything but that thing. And that is not the life of somebody who has found a vocation that is just endemic to who they are.
Yeah. No, the reading thing, I always had voice actors do my books, right the way through until Why Running Matters came out in 1216. But because it's written in the present tense and in the first person, they said, well, you've got to read it. It's really got to be you that does it.
Right.
And so I went down to Cornwall, about 80 miles from here, to a studio and on the cliffs. It was in what had been a ruined mine building on the edge of the Cornish cliffs. Very romantic place. And I had my sound engineer on the other side of the glass was a very attractive woman. And there's this sort of intensity. This is the first time I'd done this. Intensity between her there and going through everything that I was reading in my script. And it was just like mind-blowing experience for 3 days reading this book. And at the end of it, I realized, God, I discovered I could do something I never thought I could do, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Right.
So I've now said I'm going to read all my books from now on.
Well, I mean, after talking to you for nearly 3 hours now, I'm thinking, why haven't you read all of your books? I mean, you're clearly well spoken. Your diction is good. You're easy to understand, and you have a tonally pleasant voice. So.
That's nice of you to say.
Not to just blow smoke. I mean, I'm in this trade, so I can spot it. If there had been some sort of annoying nasal frequency coming at me, or some sort of whine, I would have thought, it's probably a good idea somebody else reads the books. But some people are not natural speakers, others are, and it's not a good or a bad thing. It's simply a thing. But when it comes to exactly.
I was told at the start of my career, no, you get other people to read your books. You have actors read your books. You don't need to do that. So I think, hold on, 1, 2, 3. So, yes, 16 of my books would have been, 15, 16 of my books were being read by other people before I actually did one myself.
Yeah.
And it was, I've got to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it. The last one I really enjoyed because I know these are my words and I know I can't change them, but I can shape the way that my words are actually going to reach people.
Right.
And that's such a kick.
Yes.
It's like being an ultra author, if you know what I mean. You're not
sure.
just writing the words, but you're actually delivering them to somebody's perception. And I love that.
Right. Well, and I'm sure the other 15 books were read quite well because I've actually auditioned for a couple of books on tape, as they call them, audiobooks. And it's a craft. There's a different way to deliver that. It's not a script in the same way. It is just simply written differently. And the actors who excel at it are amazing, as I'm sure the ones who have read your books are. But true enough, when you write a book, and now I've been on the other end of it, where I have my friends tell me, you're going to do the audiobook, right? Well, of course I am. Of course I am. But you're absolutely correct. When you write something, you're thinking of something very specific. If you get the words down that really reflect what you're thinking, then you've done a good job. Now, if you hand this to an actor, you may listen to it later and think, I wish you would not have inflected that word, because that's not how I meant that. That's no longer an issue. You knew what you were thinking when you wrote it. You know how you want it to come out. And now, by God, no one's in your way.
Yeah. No, absolutely right. Yeah. So I want to ask you, though, I'm going to come back on the writing thing.
Sure.
Why did you choose the 10th century?
I'll give you the, in total, how this idea came about. My brother's a very talented artist, and he's also very good at ideas. And so we talked about, because we used to play role-playing games when we were younger. We played Dungeons and Dragons and all of that. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a game where you could fight in any battle in history? Because every game always focused on this one period of history. And I thought, I want to be in all of them. All of history is fascinating. All the conflagrations, bloody as they were, I've got the luxury of distance. They're fascinating to me. I don't want to just fight in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. I want to fight at Tettenhall. So, and I didn't even know about Tettenhall until I delved into it. I thought, well, this is a really interesting period of history. I want to learn about the Vikings. What did they do? Then I learned about Tettenhall. I learned about Bardney Abbey the year before. All of that. So we started trying to put together a role-playing game. We just never got enough funding for it. We tried to crowdfund it online, and the idea wasn't, I guess, fully formed enough. So I thought, I still like this idea. I like the idea of a person visiting every significant military action in history, no matter where you are on Earth, because I think it's a remarkable way to learn about history, to learn about societies, cultures, people, and military history as well, and just to have a bit of fun, because you can keep a healthy distance from it as well. And then I thought, all right, well, I know I can write, then I should write it as a book. And if I'm going to write it as a book, it has to be a series. Now, I'm not a scholar. I don't have the resources to hire a bunch of scholars. I'm going to have to do my own research, which means it should be fairly accurate, but it's not going to be as meticulous as somebody writing from your vantage point. So I can wrestle with deeper questions of identity, humanity, society, culture, and all of that. But it's not likely to be much deeper than, say, a fun series of books like the James Bond novels. And so I thought, okay, in my mind, what I have in mind is time travel meets James Bond, a character who is implanted in different battles throughout history. And I thought I can have other characters written by other authors who have a better vantage point, characters who are of different ethnicities, dealing with different cultural military conflagrations, all of that, an umbrella for not just writing what I would hope would be a pleasant series of books, but also a way to show people that there's an entire history that you're not familiar with. And I have a friend who is Indian, and she says, people don't know about the partitioning of India and Pakistan. They just don't know anything about it. And she says, even I, as an Indian, don't know enough about it myself, and I'd love for someone to write about it from the point of view of somebody entering it from a completely separate place. This is an alien race that grabs people and says, you're going to fight in this battle, that battle. And it's to ensure the stability of a timeline. And so this history we have is the most stable one. So I thought, okay, what do I know a little bit about, or what do I have the most interest in? And I narrowed it down to the American Revolution, World War II, and English history, because my own family's history is from the north of England. I think somewhere around Cheshire. It's about far as back as we can go, the Edgerly name. I thought, okay. And the one that really appealed to me was the Viking Age, the Battle of Tettenhall. And as soon as I learned that Ethelfled was involved in it as well, I thought, she's a very interesting historical figure. Women didn't do that. Women who were the wife of a monarch typically had a role to play, and they stayed within it. And she, to a degree, again, I'm not the historian, but to my knowledge, She was a rare figure who only in the last 200 or 300 years started to get more of her due. And
Yeah,
I thought,
Victoria's
all
been a
right,
big thing. Yeah.
yeah, and so
She was a daughter of Monaco. She was married to
yeah,
the elder Bussins.
yes, and
But no,
yeah,
I mean, there was a Queen of Wessex in the late 7th century who reigned in her own right. She reigned for 2 years or so, and she was Queen of Wessex in around the 680s.
Okay.
So there are a few precedents of leading women in Saxon life.
Yeah, she's not the only one. And women in Saxon times, I learned.
The one that everybody's heard of, that she hasn't got a parallel really until the time of the conquest, when you've got Githa and the rest of the women of the Harold Godwinson's family.
Right.
So Ethelfled really stands out. The Victorians wrote quite a lot about her, and quite a lot of older histories I've come across will raise, Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, as a major character. Yeah, I mean, she's the first major female English character probably since Boudica, I suppose. And Boudica was obviously Celtic, not English. So, yeah, I can sort of understand. I mean, I always think of the 10th century as being the absolute nadir between the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Middle Ages.
Right.
And I just think that the 900, the time of the Viking incursions, increasingly from the hostility of the heathen army under Alfred, all the way through to the Norman conquest. So that 200-year period, I think, God, if any time in history I could avoid living, it would be then. After then, but those 200 years, I always think that's been pretty bloody awful. So I'm quite interested you went for the right in the middle of it.
Right. Yeah. What I found was I found two moments that I thought were most interesting. The first thing we did when we constructed the game was I looked at 20 different periods in human history around the world. One of them was the Viking Age, because it was interesting to me what was happening. The Romans left Britain, and it was somewhere around the 6th century, I guess. There were no longer any kind of a real presence there, and maybe perhaps before that as well.
The legendary date is 410.
Gotcha. Okay, 5th century then. And then the Dark Ages kind of settled in, which at the time I'm sure they didn't call them the Dark Ages. They weren't the best time to be alive either. But there was a lot of, tribes were asserting themselves once again. England was partitioned into these different kingdoms. And what a lot of people, I think, just sort of, people from my vantage point, I'm writing for the masses more than certainly academics would look at this and think, you got that wrong, you got that wrong.
Of course they would. Yeah, they'll always say that. Even if they don't think it, they'll still be wanting to say it.
Exactly. So I'm trying to get the broadest strokes right. I'm trying to represent the gist of what was happening there. And what I thought was interesting is that the Vikings, the Danes, really, mainly what they were, the Danish. And Viking wasn't even a word that was used a lot then. It was used.
No, it was used a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But the Danes is usually what you would hear more of. But they were excellent seafarers. And so, of course, they weren't that far away. They were going to find England. They were going to find that, wow, they sure do have a lot of resources here. Well, don't really care if they don't want us here or not. We're going to assert ourselves. There's this 150-year period, the Viking Age, where they were a significant factor in life in England, to the point where Anglo Saxon language and culture and Viking Danish language and culture are so intertwined that it's really hard to find historians that can tell you that there's a definite separation here. They're so mixed together that over time they still had uneasy truces all the time. They would have, all right, we'll have a truce, and then one of them would just break it capriciously. So finally, around 909, there was the excursion into Bardney Abbey to the rescue of the bones of St. Oswald, a revered warrior saint of Anglo-Saxon times. And what that said was, we're going into, I believe it was Northumbria, but I'm not sure. So
Oswald had been king of Northumbria, yeah.
Exactly. So the fact that the Anglo-Saxons could mount this sort of expedition, take this sacred relic, and take it away from the Vikings, from them owning it, from them possessing it, was a way of asserting their presence. And then Ethelfled and her brother Edward establish a legacy of not just sort of diminishing the Vikings' presence in England, but also establishing burhs or fords or fortifications.
Yeah.
So they're basically
the whole ring of the fortress was down to her. Yeah,
exactly. And so there's a real turning point there. That after Tettenhall, in which case they basically saw these raiding parties up and down existing for months and months, Vikings pillaging, they realized they're using this river to get in and out. We're going to bottleneck them. We're going to trap them. And two kings that we're pretty sure that we know of, two Viking kings at Tettenhall were killed. And so they knew that we can't just beat them. We have to really soundly beat them. We have to make sure that they're not going to be an invasive presence again. So it did not, that battle in which two kings were killed, did not end the Viking presence in England, but they were never the same presence after that. And I thought, those are two interesting inflection points that I can build a story around.
Right, I see. For me, that period, the Viking period, is particularly useful for telling people, you think going back to our eternal moral standards.
Right.
You think that people really want to have peace all the time.
Right.
Now, the idea of peace in the modern world is somewhere on a scale between Erasmus, who wrote in 1515 that all war is bad, even the worst peace is better than the best, most just war.
Right.
And at the other end, Thomas More writing that in Utopia, that these people will only fight if they have to,
right,
or if their land is invaded, or if that of a neighbour is invaded by a hostile force unfairly. So, reluctant war, never war. And and people think that's pretty much true for all society. And it has been true since then, since the 16th century. Not much has changed on that front, unless you're Putin.
Yeah.
Before that, Vikings, well, they fought as a matter of choice, and their rewards in heaven, because remember, Viking gods were mortal, their rewards in heaven were that they would be fighting all day in heaven too, and feasting all night. I mean, the idea of the rewards for fighting, I mean, it helps you explain the Crusades a lot more when you think in terms of the early medieval love of fighting, self-justification, self-realization through fighting.
Right.
And I just love being able to talk about the Vikings in that sense. You think everybody always wanted peace and saw peace as being a wonderful thing, but no, let me tell you about the Viking outlook on the world, and it's not about peace.
No,
they did trade a lot as well, but they also were primarily about war and conflict.
Right, exactly, and to that end, you met your end in battle. There was no shame in it. There was glory in that, and it's a warrior culture. And so, how do you take on a warrior culture? I mean, Anglo Saxon culture, at least to the extent I researched it, did have, you had what you called slights to your honor, which could only mean a fight to the death. And it could be something as simple as a comment. But for the most part, they didn't have quite the same ethos. But violence was simply more commonplace at the time as well. And a lot of this is because Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, writes about this in The Better Angels of Our Nature. Yeah. He writes about the fact that if you look at the homicide rate around the world, it's lowest in societies that have given the monopoly on violence to the state, to adjudicate matters, to mediate.
That's right. Yeah.
When you have cultures of honor, warrior cultures, you, as they say, you take it out to the street. You have a beef, we're going to settle this with violence. Words aren't going to work because I'm mad at you. And so how do you counter that? I mean, the only, you can't really reach a truce with a warrior culture for very long. And it's really only because either they're tired of fighting at the moment or you have leverage. But as soon as that leverage goes away, their way of mediating is by violence. And so I thought that was fascinating. You're looking at cultures that did mix quite a bit, but they knew, the Anglo-Saxons knew, these guys aren't going anywhere. We have to push them out. And it's not going to happen overnight. But this one particular battle achieved quite a bit in the pursuit of that.
So many things that you say have a chime in some way or another.
Okay. I mean, and if I'm wrong somewhere, tell me where I'm wrong, because I don't want to be wrong.
No, not at all. I was going to say, I mean, you mentioned Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature. If you ever have another slot to read another book of mine, please do read Centuries of Change, which is Millennium over your way. It's called Millennium. It asks the question, which of the last 10 centuries saw the most change? And it is informed by my views on technology. But when it comes to Steven Pinker, well, I think he's totally right at the small scale. How do we actually control personal acts of violence? I think he's totally wrong at the national scale.
Okay.
And there's an argument in there about, I try to explain this through what you might think of as enacted violence and latent or potential violence. That's the way we've actually kept society and the world more at peace in more modern times is by building up larger and larger levels of potential or latent violence. He says that's peacefulness. It only requires it to be unleashed, for example, 1939 and Hitler, for it to be completely reversed. And all that potential violence suddenly make things a lot worse. So therefore, well, I agree with him at the day-to-day level, the civilization of the individual, the control of the person. I think he's right. I completely disagree with him at the top end. And so there's a bit in there about that. But I suspect that you will like all 50 changes in that book because they are so in tune with the way you're talking and the way you're looking at the world. So if you ever have another chance to look at a book of mine, I would recommend that one. The other one is the novel I wrote that won a prize, The Outcasts of Time, which is a story about two men from this parish who get caught up in the Black Death. And in the course of the trying to, basically the panic that settles in as they're on their way back home, they try and do what they have heard through folklore might save them, which is to try and sell their souls, as it were, up on the moor at Stone Circle.
Right.
And when they try this, they get told, no, you've only got 6 days left to live, but you can choose to come back and spend each one of them 99 years apart. So this time slip novel allows you to see the world in 1348, 1447, 1546, 1643, etc. So the purpose is to show people the consequences of their actions. So you see from one century to the next in this place, what are the results of what's gone on beforehand? And in lots of different ways, you see interwoven consequences of actions, which sounds very much like what you're trying to do in your series of controlling outcomes of battles.
Right.
I mean, almost like you're the moral angel.
Exactly.
Like a moral angel of death, I suppose. I mean, that's it's got a lot in common. I mean, the vision is similar.
Yes. Well, yeah. Hopefully, it's not to the level of plagiarism because it would have been entirely.
But obviously, what's activating your mind is very similar to what I have going on in my imagination.
Yeah. I used to be a stand-up comedian for 10 years. That was my profession, and sometimes a bit you would be similar to another comedian's bit. You never knew each other. It's just called parallel thinking. But
absolutely, yeah.
It's what's happening. Yes, there's a moment where the protagonist thinks, who told these aliens that they could go in and just tinker with our history? Why do they know better than we do? Well, yeah, maybe they're ancient. Maybe they've been around since the dawn of time. But, I mean, why do they know that for sure this history is better because I'm ensuring this outcome? What if it's better if we don't? They say that they can see all the outcomes. But again, they're essentially, they're placing their thumb on the scale. And there are moments where he sees the value in it, and there are moments where he resents it. And it's because there's a part of him that just thinks, if people want to do this, if they have all decided that they're going to do this, who is one person to tell them that they're wrong? Again, it's always a question of perspective. So, I mean, these are sometimes questions without answers, but they just have to be asked and explored. Yeah. That's where the idea of being an amateur historian has come into it. I've got to accurately represent as best I can. That's not going to be easy, but easier than if I tried to do it 50 years ago because the internet has enough information on it and I can source it. Like I would go to Wikipedia sometimes, but then I would look at other people's just published articles. And then I would buy a book or two, and I would go through and try to find the relevant passage. There are so many sources for this that I couldn't possibly name them all. I can't even remember where I got everything. I just know that I would vet it through 2 or 3 other sources and say, okay, this seems to be an accepted bit of wisdom here. So that was the best I could manage. But if you have any tips, I'm open to it. You would know better than I would.
I mean, obviously, I write novels as well. I've written 4 novels that. So I did, but I'm very much a historian.
Right.
When I have novelist friends who tell me that they're doing research, this will sound terrible to you. So
no, it's okay. It's okay.
But when I have people writing historical novels, friends of mine who are writing historical novels, they've been telling me they're doing much research. In my mind, I'm thinking research is when you are looking at the archive, at the manuscript, and you are discovering things that no one else knows.
Right.
That to me is research.
Right.
Books, that's looking things up.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I'm doing. I'm looking things up because for me to describe what I'm doing as research on an academic level would be an insult to academics. It's not what it is. I'm not unearthing anything. I'm gathering data that hopefully accurately portrays an era to the point where someone reading it who knows would say, okay, I don't have any problem with this.
But on that note, I wouldn't put yourself down because you can unearth things without actually having to look at the original manuscript. You can raise questions through literature, as I do in Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England. You can raise questions that you cannot answer simply by looking at a document. And because people who are academics will prioritize the document, they will miss that question. They will fail to see what they don't know. And there have been moments in academic conferences where people have put themselves forward as knowing everything on a certain subject, and then you, whatever it might be, and then you ask them to recount what it would have been like to walk down a certain street in a certain year. And they say, well, I don't know. And if you can't actually describe the environment you're talking about, how on earth can you then sort of pretend to be an expert in it, basically? So the person who is, most au fait with the primary research, primary sources, often is the person who can't see the limitations of those primary sources. Sometimes it takes the novelist to come around and say, what about this?
Right. Well, the novelist by trade has to have an imagination that is not absolutely as required of an historian. I would think an historian still has to have a fairly large imagination. You need to be able to think in terms of beyond your everyday reality. But a novelist has to keep in mind story, characters, arcs, themes, all of that, and a way to use prose to put you, as you do in the Time Traveler's Guide, in the moment. And so this raises an interesting question, which I hadn't thought of until this moment. Have you ever tried what they call VR, virtual reality? Have you ever tried that technology? Okay.
Nope.
No. Now, you may have an absolute cellular objection to it. And that I totally understand. But I tried it, and I still have the headset for it. A gentleman who works for a company sent me one for free. It was very nice of him. And I tried it. And it's not really for me because it just makes me dizzy. Right. So it is, on the other hand, startling as to what it does for your senses. I'm curious as to whether or not an historian like yourself, working with somebody who is in the virtual reality space, could do to recreate the idea of walking into a 14th century pub and say, okay, I want this. I don't know if they do smells very well yet, but I'm sure they're working on it. I need this sound. I need this texture. I need all of this. How accurately can you recreate a 14th century day at the market in, say, Suffolk? You know, what would you think of virtual reality trying to do that?
I'd have no difficulty with the accuracy side of things, and I would wholly engage in what I could. What I think would be impossible, you have to think of the recipient. You have to think of the passenger, as it were, the person who's perceiving this. Right. What I would find impossible is to make them feel they understand what's going on around them, because if it were authentic as well as accurate,
Right.
the authenticity of the characters interplaying around them would leave them confused and appalled. They wouldn't understand the cruelty. They wouldn't understand the deep religious thread, which would go without saying. People wouldn't be talking necessarily about what they believe, but there's a religious aspect to life, a context, the hierarchies of society, so many levels of unspoken material factors would be very difficult to bring across. And people would think, well, that person's just being obnoxious or cruel or horrible.
Right.
But actually, they might be enacting the stereotypes of the time.
Right.
And to be authentic, you'd have to take that person from that time to understand it. So you could do the accuracy bit. You could make the scenes. You could have the right dyes and therefore the right colors. You could have the right textures and the right material. You could have the right layouts. You could do the right smells, I think.
Right.
You could generate the right smells. But what you couldn't do is have the understanding of what's going on around you. We live in so much in our own times. It's very difficult to appreciate what it would be. There's an article I wrote somewhere, it's a speech somewhere that, published, that's about this, that accuracy is difficult enough. Authenticity is impossible.
Right. And writing about it, conveying it authentically is one exercise. And when I have a feeling that a person is probably capable of reading a deeply unpleasant scene and processing it and absorbing it and living with it much more easily than witnessing it. And so, so in other words, in order to make it accurate, yes, it's a technical exercise, you'll get it right. In order to make it authentic, might be such a disturbing experience for your average casual virtual reality participant that it might be a non-starter. But I think it would be it would be an interesting academic exercise, but maybe not defensible. I don't know.
There's a really good example of this. I mean, one of the most common or most popular pastimes in Elizabethan England was to go to the bear baiting on the south side of the river, on the south side of the Thames. And these are alongside the Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare was. Queen Elizabeth I went to the bear baiting. She never went to see Shakespeare, but she goes to the bear baiting. It was everybody in London did. It was much more popular than the theatre. Now, at the end of a bear baiting thing, so after you've had this poor creature set upon by dogs, and throwing the dogs off, and people breaking the fall of the dogs with sticks, 2 sticks, to allow the dog to land safely and then go back into the fight. And the bear is covered with blood, and the bear is not normally allowed to die because they're too valuable. But after that whole thing, and you've had the bear baiting, bull baiting, the final act of the performance is you take a monkey, you tie it to the back of an old horse you don't care about any longer. And the English in those days were famously cruel to their horses. And then you let all the dogs go. You let all the dogs on this old horse. And people were absolutely delighted by the monkey's terror as the horse to which it is strapped is killed underneath it. And this was just whoops of joy, excitement around. Now, if you showed that and you saw your character enjoying that, if you're a novelist, if you had your character loving it, then you think you've immediately alienated your entire modern audience. You can't do it. I mean, that level of authenticity, just that attitude. You can reproduce a scene, but you cannot reproduce what they feel. Not in a way that we can sympathize with.
And so it seems like that's probably going to go the way that most movies would portray something. Again, a writer can go as deep into the weeds as they like with authenticity, because it really is more under the control of the reader as to how they're going to process it. When you witness something, that's why Errol Flynn's Robin Hood was probably not that historically accurate, but boy, was it good fun, and could you eat your popcorn to it.
My editor and I have a term called Robin Hood syndrome, which means every Hollywood film has got to have its poor people struggling against the oppressors, and every woman has to be fighting against the men who are the patriarchy. Robin Hood syndrome, we call it. You can't reflect what life was like at the time, because it's got to feed into what the modern audience expects, and that's something they can sympathize with and like. That's what entertainment's about.
Right.
So, yeah, if you make it all educational, you might lose some of the entertainment value.
We need a grasp of history, and we need it from historians. You can't get it from amateurs like me. What I hope to achieve with these books is I hope to make them entertaining, where you ask a question or two and you say to yourself, I would like to learn more about that time. Okay. Well, that Mortimer guy, he writes about it in depth, and he's actually qualified. So I would love to be a gateway to the deeper inspections of these times.
Well done for initiating this thing. It's been an absolute delight talking to you.
Oh,
Really,
great.
really enjoyed it.
Well,
Really
the pleasure is all mine. And as I continue with this exercise in writing this book and hopefully the following ones, I'd love to get your input on it because...
Right. Well, if you need to know things, if you need to know how to look anything up or where to find some data, drop me an email. You've got I'm not going to go back on social media, but you've got my email. So if you've got a specific question, you say, how do I find this?
Right.
Ask me.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Be well.
Cheers.